"Don't touch him!" Jungkook's voice exploded through the hospital hallway, so violently that even the nurses froze in place. "If Jimin dies because of this, I swear none of you will be able to stop me from destroying the person responsible." Taehyung stopped walking the second those words hit him, his face turning pale under the harsh white hospital lights, while RM immediately grabbed Jungkook's arm before things got worse. But Jungkook ripped himself free without even blinking. His eyes were red, his hands were shaking, and the way he looked directly at Taehyung made every BTS member realize something terrifying was happening behind the scenes that nobody understood yet. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And tell me honestly, if your best friend caused the person you loved most to end up unconscious in a hospital bed, would you ever forgive them? Nobody expected the night to end like this. Just 6 hours earlier, BTS had been laughing backstage after one of the biggest performances of their career. Cameras were flashing everywhere. Fans were screaming their names. Jimin looked completely fine while Jungkook stayed close beside him almost the entire night, like he was silently watching over him. But something changed after Taehyung disappeared with Jimin for nearly 20 minutes behind closed doors. Nobody knew what was said during that conversation. Nobody even realized Jimin walked out of that room crying until it was already too late, because less than an hour later, Jimin collapsed in front of dozens of staff members. And the first thing Jungkook screamed when he saw Taehyung standing nearby was something so brutal that even Jin looked horrified hearing it. And the worst part? Jungkook wasn't finished yet. The ambulance doors slammed shut while Jungkook kept one trembling hand pressed against the glass window beside Jimin's unconscious body. Nobody inside the vehicle dared speak because the atmosphere already felt suffocating enough. Jimin's skin looked pale under the flashing emergency lights while the medic continued checking his pulse every few seconds with growing concern. Jungkook sat beside him completely frozen at first, but the second the medic quietly mentioned the words "severe exhaustion mixed with emotional distress," something inside Jungkook snapped again. "What happened before he collapsed?" Jungkook asked without looking at anyone. His voice sounded low. Dangerous. RM exchanged a quick glance with Jin in the corner of the ambulance while nobody answered immediately. That silence only made Jungkook angrier. I asked a question. This time his voice became sharper. Taehyung finally looked away toward the floor. That tiny reaction was enough. Jungkook noticed it instantly. "You were with him before this happened." Taehyung swallowed hard but still stayed quiet. Jungkook stood up so suddenly the medic almost shouted at him to sit back down. "What did you say to him?" The tension exploded so fast that even J-Hope looked genuinely nervous trying to calm the situation down. "Jungkook, not now," he warned quietly. But Jungkook ignored him completely. His eyes stayed locked on Taehyung the entire time, like he was seconds away from losing control. "You think I didn't notice something was wrong tonight?" Jungkook continued. "Jimin hasn't slept properly in days. He barely ate anything this week, and right after talking to you, he suddenly couldn't even stand anymore." Taehyung clenched his jaw tightly before finally speaking. "I didn't make him collapse." "Then explain why he was crying." The ambulance suddenly became silent again. Jin slowly looked toward Taehyung with visible confusion, because this was the first time anyone heard that detail out loud. Jungkook laughed bitterly under his breath before rubbing both hands across his face in frustration. "He tried hiding it from me backstage," he muttered, "but I saw it." RM's expression changed instantly. Jimin was crying? Jungkook nodded once without taking his eyes off Taehyung. And now he's unconscious. Nobody missed the guilt flashing across Taehyung's face after those words. That single reaction only made everything worse, because now every member inside that ambulance started realizing there was a secret conversation none of them knew about. And judging from Taehyung's silence, it was serious. The ambulance finally arrived at the hospital only minutes later, but the moment doctors rushed Jimin away on the stretcher, Jungkook grabbed Taehyung's wrist hard enough to stop him from walking. "You're not leaving until you tell me the truth." Taehyung immediately pulled away. "This isn't the place." "Then where?" Jungkook fired back. "After another ambulance ride? After another collapse?" RM quickly stepped between them before things turned ugly in front of the hospital staff. "Enough!" But Jungkook was breathing heavily now, barely holding himself together. "You all keep protecting each other until someone breaks," he said bitterly, "and Jimin's always the one pretending he's okay." Those words hit harder than anyone expected because nobody could deny them. Jimin had always smiled through pressure, through exhaustion, through pain. Even when things got bad, he hid it better than everyone else. And suddenly all the members started replaying the last few weeks in their heads. Jimin canceling meals, Jimin staying alone in hotel rooms, Jimin avoiding eye contact during rehearsals, Jimin forcing smiles during interviews. The signs had been there the entire time. They just missed them. Or maybe they ignored them because it was easier. The hospital waiting room became painfully quiet nearly 20 minutes later, while doctors continued examining Jimin upstairs. Jungkook sat forward in his chair with both hands locked together so tightly his knuckles turned white. Nobody dared interrupt him anymore, not after the way he exploded earlier. Taehyung stayed near the opposite wall, completely silent, while Suga quietly watched both of them with growing suspicion. Something clearly happened between them, something bigger than a normal argument. Then Jungkook suddenly stood up again. "I'm asking one last time." Everyone looked up immediately. "What did you say to him tonight?" Taehyung closed his eyes briefly before finally answering. "I told him he needed to stop depending on you so much." The entire room froze. Jungkook stared at him in disbelief. "What?" Taehyung exhaled slowly like he already regretted saying it. "Jimin's been falling apart emotionally for months, and nobody notices because he hides behind you every time things get difficult." Jungkook stepped closer instantly. "Watch your mouth." "I'm serious," Taehyung continued. "Every time he struggles, he runs to you instead of facing anything himself." "That's not your decision to make." "Someone had to say it." Jungkook laughed coldly. "So you cornered him alone before a major performance and decided to tear him apart emotionally?" Taehyung's patience finally cracked too. "Because you're making it worse." RM immediately stood up, seeing the situation spiral out of control again. "Stop talking right now." But neither of them listened anymore. "You act like protecting him gives you ownership over him," Taehyung snapped. "You don't understand what he's sacrificing mentally just to keep you close." Jungkook's expression changed instantly after hearing that sentence. Something darker entered his eyes. What exactly is that supposed to mean? Taehyung realized too late he had said too much, and Jungkook noticed immediately. "No." Jungkook shook his head slowly. "You know something." Taehyung stayed silent again. Huge mistake, because now Jungkook looked genuinely terrified underneath all the anger. "What is Jimin hiding from me?" Nobody in that waiting room moved. Nobody breathed properly. Even the distant hospital noises outside suddenly felt muted beneath the crushing tension growing between them. Then Taehyung quietly answered with 4 words that changed everything. "He didn't want you knowing." Jungkook's face lost all color, and upstairs behind the closed hospital room door, Jimin still hadn't opened his eyes.
Jungkook stared at Taehyung like the entire world had stopped moving around him. What didn't he want me knowing? His voice no longer sounded angry now. That was what scared everyone more. It sounded hurt, deeply hurt. Taehyung looked away again while RM immediately stepped forward. "Don't do this here." But Jungkook ignored him completely. "Answer me." Jin quietly rubbed his forehead in frustration because the atmosphere inside the waiting room had become unbearable. Nobody expected a normal hospital visit to turn into something this personal. Suga stayed silent the entire time, but even he could tell this situation had been building for weeks behind closed doors. Taehyung finally spoke carefully. Jimin's been struggling longer than you think. I know he's tired. No, Taehyung interrupted softly. You know the version he allows you to see. That sentence hit harder than anyone expected. Jungkook immediately shook his head. You're talking like I don't know him. Sometimes loving someone too much makes you miss what's right in front of you. The room became quiet again. J-Hope finally stood up, trying to ease the tension before things exploded once more. Can we please wait until Jimin wakes up before turning this into another fight? But Jungkook's attention never left Taehyung. You talked to him alone tonight for 20 minutes, he said slowly. And now he's upstairs unconscious. Taehyung clenched his jaw. Because he was already breaking before tonight, Jungkook's breathing became heavier again. Then why didn't anyone tell me? Nobody answered immediately. That silence alone already felt like betrayal. Jungkook looked from member to member, searching for someone to deny it. Nobody did. Arm finally sighed quietly. We noticed he was struggling. Jungkook turned toward him so fast the chair beside him nearly fell over. You knew too? Not everything. How long? RM hesitated. Another bad sign. Jungkook laughed bitterly under his breath again. Unbelievable. Jin quickly stepped in before the situation turned worse. We were trying to protect everyone. Protect, Jungkook snapped. By hiding things from me? Suga finally spoke for the first time. Jimin asked us not to say anything. That answer instantly silenced Jungkook. His expression slowly shifted from anger into something more painful, confusion. Why would he do that? Nobody could answer properly because none of them fully understood it either. Over the last few months, Jimin had become harder to read. He still smiled during interviews, still joked during rehearsals, still comforted everyone else whenever tensions rose inside the group. But when cameras disappeared, he often became distant, quiet, lost inside his own thoughts. Jungkook suddenly remembered all the nights Jimin claimed he was just tired before disappearing alone into hotel balconies for hours. He remembered rehearsals where Jimin kept dancing despite obvious exhaustion. He remembered waking up at 3 a.m. more than once only to realize Jimin wasn't sleeping beside the others. The signs had been there. Taehyung lowered his voice carefully. He thought you already carried too much pressure. Jungkook looked stunned hearing that. So instead he carried everything alone? Taehyung didn't answer. Because that was exactly what happened. A nurse suddenly entered the waiting room, instantly pulling everyone's attention away from the argument. Family of Park Jimin? Arm immediately stood up first. How is he? The nurse gave a small reassuring nod. He's stable now, but he's still unconscious. The doctors believe severe stress and exhaustion caused his condition to worsen suddenly. Jungkook exhaled shakily the second he heard the word stable, but the nurse wasn't finished. There's also signs he's been physically overworking himself for a long time. Jin closed his eyes immediately in frustration. Suga looked toward the floor, and Jungkook slowly turned back toward the members with visible disbelief. How did none of us stop this? Nobody answered because nobody had a good answer anymore. The nurse continued speaking. Only one person can visit him briefly once he wakes up. Jungkook immediately stepped forward without hesitation. I'll stay. But before the nurse could answer, Taehyung quietly spoke behind him. Jimin might not want that first. The room froze again instantly. Jungkook turned slowly. What did you just say? Taehyung looked conflicted now, like he was debating whether to continue speaking at all. But eventually he did. He paused. It was about you. Jungkook's face hardened. Explain. Arm quietly muttered under his breath, already sensing disaster coming. Taehyung finally continued. Jimin thinks staying close to you is hurting both of you emotionally. Jungkook stared at him in complete disbelief. That's ridiculous. He doesn't think your relationship is healthy anymore. Those words landed like a bomb inside the waiting room. J-Hope immediately stood up. Okay, stop. But Jungkook wasn't listening anymore. His eyes looked completely shaken now. He said that? Taehyung nodded once. Tonight. Jungkook looked away for the first time since arriving at the hospital. And somehow that reaction hurt more than all his anger earlier. Because everyone could see it clearly now. Jungkook wasn't furious because of pride. He was terrified of losing Jimin completely. Taehyung rubbed both hands over his face before speaking again. He said every time he falls apart emotionally, the only thing keeping him together is you. Jungkook whispered quietly. Isn't that normal? Taehyung's expression darkened. Not when he starts forgetting who he is without you. Silence crushed the room again. Jungkook looked genuinely shaken hearing those words. His mind immediately replayed dozens of moments he once thought were comforting. Jimin constantly checking if Jungkook had eaten. Jimin changing schedules just to stay nearby. Jimin hiding his own problems whenever Jungkook seemed stressed. Suddenly, those memories no longer felt simple. They felt heavy, painful. That's why you argued? Jungkook finally asked quietly. Taehyung nodded slowly. I told him he needed space. And he cried because of it? Because he already knew I was right. Jungkook immediately looked furious again. No. His voice became sharper. You pushed him when he was already vulnerable. Taehyung stepped closer too. Because none of you would. RM instantly moved between them again before another explosion happened in the middle of the hospital. Enough! This time his voice echoed loudly through the hallway. Everyone finally went silent. RM looked exhausted now, angry too. Jimin is upstairs fighting to recover while all of you are tearing each other apart down here. Nobody spoke after that. Even Jungkook looked momentarily ashamed. Then suddenly the nurse returned again, looking slightly surprised. He's awake! Every member stood up instantly. But before anyone could move, the nurse added one more sentence that stopped Jungkook cold. He asked for Taehyung first.
The second those words left the nurse's mouth, the entire hallway turned silent. Jungkook looked completely frozen, like his brain refused to process what he had just heard. Even Taehyung looked surprised. He asked for me? He repeated quietly. The nurse nodded once. Only briefly. He seems emotionally overwhelmed. Jungkook let out a small laugh under his breath, but there was nothing amused about it. It sounded crushed. Hurt. Of course. RM immediately stepped forward after noticing the dangerous shift in Jungkook's expression. Jungkook. No. Jungkook pulled away before RM could even finish speaking. It's fine. But it clearly wasn't fine. Everyone could see it in the way Jungkook's hands were trembling again. Taehyung hesitated for a second before walking toward the hospital room, but right before he reached the door, Jungkook suddenly spoke again. If he cries because of you one more time tonight, his voice dropped dangerously low, I won't stay quiet again. Taehyung stopped walking for a brief second without turning around. Then he quietly entered Jimin's room, while the automatic door slowly closed behind him. The moment the door shut, Jungkook immediately looked away and clenched his jaw so tightly it almost looked painful. Jin carefully approached him first. He probably just wants answers. Jungkook laughed bitterly again. Or maybe he doesn't want to see me. Nobody answered. Because after everything Taehyung revealed earlier, nobody knew what Jimin truly wanted anymore. Inside the hospital room, the atmosphere felt completely different. Quiet. Heavy. Jimin looked weak beneath the dim lighting while machines continued softly beeping beside his bed. His eyes slowly moved toward Taehyung the second he stepped closer. You told them, Jimin whispered weakly. Taehyung sighed softly. Not everything. Jimin closed his eyes immediately in frustration. Jungkook knows enough now. He deserved to. Jimin looked exhausted hearing that answer. You don't understand. Then explain it to me, Taehyung said quietly while sitting beside the bed. Because from the outside it looks like you're destroying yourself trying to protect him. Jimin stayed silent for several seconds. Then finally he whispered something so quietly Taehyung almost missed it. I don't know how to stop anymore. That answer hit Taehyung harder than expected. Jimin slowly turned his head toward the ceiling while his voice weakened further. Every time Jungkook struggles, I feel responsible for fixing it. Taehyung listened carefully without interrupting. Every time he looks exhausted, I hide my own problems because I don't want to burden him. Jimin swallowed hard before continuing, and somehow, somewhere along the way, I forgot how to breathe normally without checking if he's okay first. Taehyung lowered his eyes. Because that was exactly what he feared. Jimin looked emotionally drained now, like years of pressure were finally spilling out all at once. You love him too much, Taehyung admitted quietly. Jimin smiled weakly. That's the problem. Outside the room, Jungkook sat alone at the end of the hallway now, while the other members stayed nearby in uncomfortable silence. Nobody knew what to say to him anymore. J-Hope eventually sat beside him carefully. He'll talk to you. Jungkook stared blankly toward the floor. What if he doesn't want to anymore? J-Hope frowned immediately. Don't say that. Jungkook rubbed both hands over his face slowly. You didn't hear him tonight before the performance. That caught J-Hope's attention instantly. What happened? Jungkook stayed quiet for a moment before answering. I found him alone backstage. His voice sounded distant now, like he was replaying the memory in real time. He looked nervous, worse than usual. Jin and RM slowly moved closer too after hearing this. Jungkook continued quietly. I asked if he was okay. He paused briefly, and he smiled. Suga sighed softly under his breath, because that answer alone already explained too much. Jungkook looked up slowly, but it didn't feel real. The hallway stayed silent while Jungkook continued speaking. I told him we could cancel the after party and go back early. RM frowned slightly. You never told us that. Jungkook nodded once. Because he refused immediately. His jaw tightened again, remembering it. He said he didn't want to ruin anyone's mood. Jin closed his eyes briefly in guilt. That sounded exactly like Jimin. Always protecting everyone else first, even when he was falling apart himself. Jungkook's voice became quieter. Then right before he walked away, he stopped talking for a second like the memory physically hurt. He hugged me. RM looked surprised hearing that detail. Jungkook swallowed hard. And he said thank you. Nobody spoke after that, because suddenly it sounded less like a normal interaction and more like a goodbye nobody recognized at the time. Back inside the hospital room, Taehyung finally stood up after nearly 15 minutes of talking with Jimin alone. You need to tell him yourself, he said softly. Jimin looked nervous immediately. I can't. You have to. If I say everything out loud... Jimin's voice cracked slightly. Nothing between us will stay the same anymore. Taehyung looked at him sadly for several seconds. Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Jimin closed his eyes again without answering. The exhaustion on his face looked overwhelming now. Emotionally, physically, mentally. Taehyung quietly moved toward the door before stopping one final time. He's terrified right now, he admitted softly. Even after everything, the only thing Jungkook cares about is whether you'll push him away. Jimin's expression instantly weakened hearing that, because deep down, that fear existed on both sides. The automatic door finally opened again seconds later. Every member immediately looked up the second Taehyung stepped back into the hallway. Jungkook stood up instantly. Well, Taehyung hesitated. Bad sign already. He's awake, he answered carefully, but he's emotionally exhausted. Jungkook took a step closer. Did he ask for me? Taehyung stayed silent for 1 second too long, and that silence shattered something inside Jungkook immediately. He thinks seeing you right now will make things harder, Taehyung admitted quietly. Jungkook stared at him in disbelief. Harder? Taehyung looked genuinely conflicted now. Jimin thinks if he sees you, he'll change his mind again. RM frowned instantly. About what? Taehyung slowly looked toward Jungkook before answering. About finally walking away. The entire hallway froze. Jungkook looked like all the air had just been ripped from his lungs. And inside the hospital room, Jimin quietly began crying alone.
Jungkook didn't react immediately after hearing those words. That silence alone scared everyone more than another outburst would have. He just stood there in the middle of the hallway staring at Taehyung while the fluorescent hospital lights reflected weakly in his eyes. Walking away? He finally repeated quietly. Taehyung looked exhausted now too. Jungkook? No. Jungkook cut him off instantly. I want the exact truth. RM stepped closer again, already sensing another emotional collapse coming. But Jungkook continued before anyone could stop him. Are you telling me Jimin wants to leave me? Taehyung clenched his jaw before answering carefully. I'm saying Jimin thinks staying close to you is destroying him emotionally. The words landed brutally. Jin looked away immediately while J-Hope rubbed both hands over his face in frustration. Nobody wanted this conversation happening here, not like this, but the damage was already done. Jungkook laughed softly under his breath again, except this time the sound almost felt empty. Destroying him, he repeated the phrase like he couldn't believe it. Then suddenly his expression hardened, and you encouraged him to leave. I encouraged him to stop sacrificing himself. Taehyung shot back. There's a difference. The tension exploded again instantly. Suga stood up from his chair this time, his voice calm but firm. Enough. Everyone went quiet for a second. Suga rarely stepped into emotional conflicts unless things became serious. And right now they clearly had. He looked directly at Jungkook first. You're angry because you're scared. Then he turned toward Taehyung. And you pushed too hard because you're scared too. Taehyung looked away immediately. Jungkook stayed silent. Suga exhaled slowly. But none of this changes the fact Jimin is upstairs blaming himself for everything right now. That sentence hit the group hard because everyone knew it was true. Jimin always carried guilt even when situations weren't his fault. If the members fought because of him, he blamed himself. If someone looked exhausted, he blamed himself. If tensions rose inside the group, somehow Jimin always ended up apologizing first. Jungkook slowly sat back down again, but this time he looked emotionally drained instead of furious. Why didn't he tell me himself? He whispered quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Then RM carefully sat beside him. Maybe because he thought you'd blame yourself too. Jungkook's eyes lowered toward the floor, and the terrifying part was RM was probably right. Inside the hospital room, Jimin wiped his face quickly after hearing movement outside the door. He hated crying where people could notice, even now, even after everything. The doctor quietly entered with a gentle expression before checking the monitors beside the bed. You need proper rest, the doctor said calmly. Jimin forced a weak nod. Can I leave tomorrow? The doctor looked genuinely surprised. Absolutely not. Jimin sighed softly in frustration. I have schedules, not anymore tonight. The doctor's tone became firmer. Your body reached its limit. Jimin looked away silently after hearing that, because deep down he already knew. The doctor studied him carefully for another moment before speaking again. Stress like this doesn't appear overnight. Jimin didn't answer. Whatever pressure you've been carrying, the doctor continued gently, you can't survive by pretending it doesn't exist. Those words lingered painfully in Jimin's mind even after the doctor left the room again. Because pretending had become normal for him, smiling through exhaustion, laughing through pressure, comforting others while silently falling apart himself. He became so good at hiding it that eventually even Jungkook stopped seeing how bad things truly were. Or maybe Jungkook noticed more than Jimin realized. That possibility somehow hurt more. Back in the hallway, nearly another hour passed with nobody leaving. The atmosphere remained painfully tense. Jin quietly brought drinks for everyone, though most remained untouched. RM kept checking messages from management outside the waiting area while J-Hope tried distracting himself by pacing slowly near the windows. But Jungkook hadn't moved at all. He kept staring toward Jimin's hospital room door like he was waiting for something terrible to happen the second he looked away. Then suddenly the door opened again. Every member looked up instantly. This time it was the doctor. He's asking for Jungkook. Jungkook stood up so fast his chair nearly crashed backward onto the floor. The others exchanged quick glances, but nobody stopped him this time. Taehyung quietly stepped aside without saying a word. Jungkook hesitated briefly outside the door before entering alone. The moment he stepped inside, his chest tightened painfully seeing Jimin properly for the first time since the collapse. Jimin looked smaller somehow beneath the hospital blankets, exhausted, fragile. Completely different from the confident performer everyone saw on stage just hours earlier. Jimin slowly turned his head toward him. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them felt heavy enough to break apart on its own. Jungkook carefully moved closer to the bed. You scared me. His voice sounded rough now, emotional exhaustion finally catching up to him. Jimin lowered his eyes quietly. Sorry, Jungkook immediately shook his head. Don't apologize for this. Another silence followed, longer this time, more painful. Then Jungkook finally asked the question, destroying him since earlier. Are you really trying to leave me? Jimin's expression weakened instantly hearing those words directly from him. He looked away again before answering softly. I don't know anymore. Jungkook looked shattered. What does that mean? Jimin swallowed hard. It means I'm tired, then lean on me. That's the problem. Jungkook frowned deeply. Why is that a problem? Jimin's voice trembled slightly now despite trying to stay calm. Because somewhere along the way, you became the only thing keeping me together. Jungkook stepped closer immediately, then I'll stay. But Jimin shook his head weakly. You don't understand. His eyes slowly filled again despite trying to hold everything back. I don't know who I am when I'm not protecting you anymore. Jungkook looked completely stunned hearing that. Jimin finally forced himself to continue. Every decision I make, he paused shakily. Every emotion, every schedule, every thought, his voice cracked harder now. Everything started revolving around you. Jungkook opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Because for the first time, he realized how deep this actually went. Jimin looked terrified now, like finally speaking honestly hurt more than hiding ever did. And the worst part is, he slowly looked directly into Jungkook's eyes again. Even now, even after collapsing, the only thing I'm scared of is hurting you by saying this. Jungkook's entire expression broke apart hearing that confession. He moved closer instinctively before stopping himself at the last second, because suddenly he wasn't sure if comforting Jimin would help anymore or make everything worse. Then Jimin whispered something so quietly it almost disappeared beneath the sound of the heart monitor beside him. I think I forgot how to save myself. And for the first time that night, Jungkook had absolutely no idea how to fix it.
Jungkook stood completely still beside Jimin's hospital bed, while those final words echoed inside his head again and again. I think I forgot how to save myself. Nothing in the room felt normal anymore after hearing that. Not the quiet beeping machines, not the dim hospital lights, not even the silence between them. Because suddenly Jungkook realized this wasn't just exhaustion. This wasn't one bad night. Jimin had been drowning emotionally for a long time, while everyone, including him, kept mistaking survival for stability. Jungkook slowly sat down beside the bed, his movements careful now, almost nervous. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Jimin gave a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. Because you would have blamed yourself. Jungkook immediately looked away because the painful truth was, he already did. Every memory from the past few months suddenly felt different now. Jimin canceling his own breaks to stay beside him during rehearsals. Jimin quietly defending him during arguments with management. Jimin staying awake during long flights just because Jungkook couldn't sleep properly. Things Jungkook once saw as love now looked dangerously close to self-destruction. Jimin noticed the guilt forming across Jungkook's face instantly. See? He whispered softly. That's exactly why. Jungkook rubbed one hand across his mouth slowly before finally speaking again. You should have let me help. Jimin's eyes lowered toward the blanket covering him. I didn't know how anymore. The honesty in his voice felt painful, raw, and worse than any argument earlier tonight. Outside the room, the remaining BTS members waited in suffocating silence. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever conversation was happening inside, but the tension spreading through the hallway felt unbearable now. Jin quietly sat beside Taehyung after nearly 20 minutes passed. What exactly did Jimin tell you before the performance? Taehyung hesitated, then finally answered. He said he was tired of feeling emotionally dependent. RM looked up immediately from across the room. Dependent on Jungkook? Taehyung nodded slowly. He said every time they drift apart, even slightly, he panics. J-Hope frowned deeply hearing that. That sounds serious. It is serious, Taehyung admitted quietly, but Jimin kept pretending it wasn't. Suga leaned back in his chair silently before speaking in a calm voice. And you thought forcing him to face it alone right before a major performance was smart? Taehyung looked frustrated immediately. I wasn't trying to hurt him. But that answer landed hard. Taehyung exhaled sharply before finally admitting the truth nobody expected. Because I was angry too. The others immediately looked toward him. At who? Jin asked carefully. Taehyung's jaw tightened. At both of them, RM frowned. Why? Taehyung stayed silent briefly before answering. Because everyone in this group kept watching their relationship become emotionally unhealthy while pretending it was romantic. Nobody spoke after that. The hallway suddenly felt heavier, more uncomfortable, because somewhere deep down, parts of what Taehyung said felt true. Inside Jimin's hospital room, the atmosphere slowly shifted from confrontation into something more fragile. Jungkook leaned forward quietly, his elbows resting against his knees, while exhaustion finally showed across his face too. Do you really want space from me? He asked softly. Jimin looked conflicted immediately. I don't want to lose you. That's not what I asked. Jimin closed his eyes briefly in frustration. That's because I don't know the answer. Jungkook's chest tightened painfully hearing that uncertainty. Jimin slowly continued. When I'm around you, everything feels safe. He paused shakily. But it also feels like I stopped living for myself a long time ago. Jungkook stared at him silently. And I hate myself for feeling that way, Jimin admitted. Because you never asked me to sacrifice anything. Jungkook immediately answered. Then don't. Jimin looked up at him sadly. It's not that easy anymore. Another painful silence settled between them. Then Jungkook quietly asked something he'd been afraid to say all night. Did Taehyung tell you to leave me? Jimin shook his head immediately. No. Then why does he sound like he wants us apart? Jimin hesitated. Another dangerous pause. Because he saw what I was becoming before anyone else did. Jungkook looked genuinely hurt hearing that. Including me. Jimin's expression weakened instantly. No, but Jungkook already understood anyway. He had missed signs. Important ones. Maybe because he trusted Jimin's smile too much. Maybe because he wanted to believe things were okay. Or maybe because deep down, Jungkook depended on Jimin emotionally just as much. That realization hit him harder than expected. Because if Jimin walked away, what exactly would happen to him too? Back outside, management finally arrived at the hospital nearly past midnight. The moment the staff entered the waiting area, the atmosphere shifted again immediately. Stress returned fast. Media already knows something happened, one manager said quietly while checking his phone. We're trying to keep details private. RM nodded tiredly. No statements tonight. Another staff member looked concerned. There's already rumors spreading online about member conflict backstage. Taehyung immediately looked away hearing that. Jin sighed heavily. Perfect. Suga crossed his arms quietly. How much leaked? Enough. The manager lowered his voice further. Some staff heard Jungkook yelling earlier. Nobody looked surprised. Jungkook's outburst in the hallway had been impossible to ignore. J-Hope rubbed both hands over his face in frustration again. This keeps getting worse. The manager hesitated before asking carefully, was there actually a fight? Nobody answered immediately, because the real answer felt too complicated now. It wasn't just one fight. It was months of emotional pressure finally exploding all at once. Inside the room, Jimin suddenly looked exhausted again after talking for so long. Jungkook noticed instantly. You should rest. Jimin gave a weak nod but didn't look away from him. Are you angry? Jungkook looked stunned hearing that question. At you? Jimin stayed quiet. Jungkook shook his head immediately. Never. Jimin's eyes softened slightly for the first time all night. But the relief only lasted seconds before Jungkook quietly added, I'm angry I didn't notice how bad things became. Jimin swallowed hard. I didn't want you carrying this too. Jungkook almost laughed hearing that. Jimin, you collapsed. The reality of it finally settled fully into the room again. Jimin looked away weakly. Jungkook lowered his voice carefully. You don't have to protect everyone every second. Jimin whispered back almost immediately. Then who will? That answer alone explained everything. Years of pressure, responsibility, emotional exhaustion. Jimin had spent so long becoming everyone's emotional support that he no longer knew how to stop. Jungkook stared at him quietly before finally making a decision. Then things change after tonight. Jimin looked confused. What do you mean? Jungkook leaned closer slightly, his voice calm now but firm. No more pretending you're okay when you're not. Jimin looked nervous instantly. Jungkook? No. This time Jungkook interrupted him gently. I mean it. His eyes stayed locked onto Jimin's. If we stay in each other's lives, then we stop destroying ourselves trying to protect one another. Jimin's expression slowly cracked emotionally hearing that. Because deep down, it was the first time someone finally said exactly what he needed to hear. But before Jimin could respond, the hospital room door suddenly opened again. And the moment both of them looked up, they immediately realized from RM's expression alone that something outside had just gone very wrong. RM stepped inside the hospital room slowly, but the tension on his face immediately changed the atmosphere. Jungkook stood up first. What happened? RM closed the door carefully behind him before answering. Someone leaked information to the press. Jimin's tired expression instantly hardened with worry. What kind of information? RM hesitated for half a second too long. Another bad sign. They're saying there was a serious fight between members before your collapse. Jungkook cursed quietly under his breath while Jimin immediately pushed himself up slightly despite the pain visible on his face. No, RM nodded grimly. Videos are already spreading online. Jungkook's jaw tightened. From the hospital? From backstage earlier. RM looked exhausted now. Someone recorded part of the argument. The room fell silent. Jimin slowly looked toward Jungkook with growing panic in his eyes. What exactly did they hear? RM rubbed one hand across his forehead. Mostly shouting. He paused briefly. But your names are clearly mentioned. Jungkook looked furious again instantly. Unbelievable. Jimin's breathing became uneven now, stress visibly rising all over again. RM noticed immediately. Don't think about it right now. But Jimin already was. Because public pressure had always been one of the biggest reasons he kept hiding everything emotionally. The second rumors started spreading. Everything became worse. Expectations, speculation, pressure, judgment. Jungkook turned toward him instantly after noticing the panic returning across Jimin's face. Hey, his voice softened immediately. Look at me. Jimin forced himself to focus on him instead. Jungkook carefully stepped closer again. None of this matters tonight. It does, Jimin whispered weakly. People will blame everyone. RM sighed quietly because that fear was realistic. The internet loved creating narratives before learning the truth, and if the public sensed tension inside BTS, the situation could spiral fast. Management's handling it, RM assured carefully, but even he didn't sound fully convinced. Outside the room, the remaining members sat in tense silence, while staff members rushed through phone calls nearby. Jin leaned back against the wall, exhausted. This timing couldn't be worse. Suga crossed his arms quietly. It was always going to happen eventually. Taehyung looked toward him immediately. What's that supposed to mean? Suga answered calmly. Everyone saw emotional cracks forming months ago. Taehyung looked frustrated again. Then why did nobody say anything? J-Hope gave him a tired look. Because we're not therapists. No, Taehyung replied quietly. But we're supposed to be family. That sentence hit harder than expected. Because despite all their success, schedules, and fame, moments like this reminded them how fragile their relationships could become under pressure. Inside the hospital room, Jimin suddenly asked the question nobody wanted to hear. Did they record Jungkook yelling at Taehyung? RM stayed silent. That answer alone was enough. Jimin closed his eyes immediately in frustration while Jungkook looked ready to explode again. I don't care about rumors, Jungkook muttered. I care that people keep pushing him while he's like this. RM lowered his voice carefully. That's exactly why you need to calm down. Jungkook looked away sharply. I am calm. Nobody believed that. Especially not Jimin. Jimin quietly watched Jungkook for several seconds before finally speaking. You look exhausted too. Jungkook immediately answered without hesitation. I'm fine. Jimin almost smiled hearing that. See? Jungkook frowned slightly. What? You do the exact same thing I do. That realization instantly silenced him. RM quietly looked between both of them without interrupting. Because for the first time tonight, the conversation no longer felt like blame. It felt honest. Painfully honest. Jimin slowly continued. You carry pressure alone too. Jungkook rubbed both hands over his face in frustration. Not like you. You hide things differently. Jungkook didn't respond, because deep down he knew Jimin was right. He hid stress through silence. Through isolation. Through trying to appear strong for everyone else. Especially for Jimin. And maybe that was part of the problem too. RM finally stepped back toward the door. The company wants everyone staying quiet publicly tonight. Jungkook nodded once without looking up, but Jimin suddenly spoke again before RM could leave. Did Taehyung say anything after the leak? RM paused. No. Jimin lowered his eyes slowly. Guilt immediately spread across his face again. Jungkook noticed instantly. Stop blaming yourself. Jimin whispered back quietly. He was only trying to help me. Jungkook looked conflicted hearing that. Because despite all his anger toward Taehyung, part of him understood it too now. Taehyung had noticed something dangerous before everyone else. He just handled it badly. Very badly. The hospital room became quiet again until suddenly Jimin asked something unexpected. Were you really that scared earlier? Jungkook looked up immediately. What kind of question is that? Jimin's voice weakened again. When I collapsed, Jungkook froze completely for a moment. Then he slowly sat back down beside the bed. I thought I lost you. The honesty in his voice hit Jimin hard instantly. Jungkook looked away before continuing quietly. When you stopped moving, his jaw tightened slightly. I couldn't think properly anymore. Jimin stared at him silently, while guilt and emotion mixed together painfully in his chest. Jungkook exhaled shakily. I kept replaying our last conversation in my head, wondering if I missed something important. Jimin's eyes slowly softened hearing that. You didn't. Jungkook laughed weakly under his breath. Apparently, I missed a lot. Another silence followed, but this time it didn't feel angry. It felt fragile, honest, exhausted. Then suddenly there was another knock at the door before anyone could continue. Jin stepped inside carefully. Sorry. His voice stayed low. But there's another problem. RM immediately looked concerned again. What now? Jin hesitated awkwardly before answering. Taehyung's gone. Jungkook stood up instantly. What do you mean, gone? Jin sighed heavily. He left the hospital alone. RM cursed quietly under his breath. That's a terrible idea right now. Jimin immediately looked worried despite everything. Did anyone call him? He's not answering. The tension inside the room returned immediately. Because everybody knew Taehyung leaving alone while rumors spread online could easily create another disaster. Jungkook grabbed his jacket without hesitation. RM immediately stepped forward. You're not going after him like this. Someone has to. Not you. Jungkook looked irritated already. Why? RM answered bluntly. Because right now both of you are emotionally unstable. The room fell silent after that brutal honesty. Jungkook clenched his jaw but couldn't deny it either. Jimin slowly looked toward him from the hospital bed. Please don't fight with him again. Jungkook's expression softened immediately, hearing Jimin say that instead of defending himself. I'm not promising anything. But Jimin quietly held his wrist before he could turn away. That simple contact instantly stopped him. Jimin's tired eyes met his carefully. I can't handle watching people I care about destroy each other because of me. Jungkook looked completely torn hearing those words. And before anyone in the room could say another sentence, Jungkook's phone suddenly started ringing loudly in his pocket. The second he looked at the screen, his expression changed instantly. Because the caller ID showed Taehyung's name. But the moment Jungkook answered, the only thing he heard on the other end was heavy breathing, followed by the sound of someone yelling in panic nearby. Taehyung? Jungkook's voice sharpened instantly the second he heard the chaos on the other end of the call. Heavy breathing, loud voices, something crashing in the background. Then silence for 2 terrifying seconds before Taehyung finally spoke. Don't come here. Jungkook frowned immediately. Where are you? Another loud noise echoed through the phone like a crowd pushing nearby. RM stepped closer after hearing the tension rising again. What's happening? Jungkook ignored him completely. Taehyung, answer me. Taehyung sounded frustrated and out of breath now. Some reporters followed me outside the hospital. Jin cursed quietly under his breath while RM immediately understood how serious this could become. If reporters captured emotional footage tonight, rumors would explode beyond control. Jungkook's voice dropped dangerously low again. Did they touch you? No. Another pause. But people are recording. Jungkook was already reaching for the door. RM grabbed his arm instantly. Don't. Move. You'll make it worse. Jungkook pulled away sharply. He's alone. RM's expression hardened too now. And you're emotional. The room became tense again immediately. Jimin watched the situation unfold from the hospital bed with growing anxiety. Please, his voice sounded weak but urgent. Don't turn this into another fight. Jungkook looked toward him instantly after hearing that. The exhaustion on Jimin's face alone was enough to slow him down slightly. But before anyone could speak again, Taehyung's voice suddenly returned through the phone. Quieter this time, more shaken. Someone leaked private details. Jungkook froze. What details? Silence. Bad silence. Then Taehyung finally answered. About you and Jimin. Every person inside the room went still immediately. RM looked alarmed. Jin's expression tightened instantly. Even Jimin's face lost color again. Jungkook slowly lowered the phone from his ear for 1 second, like he couldn't process the sentence properly. What exactly leaked? Taehyung exhaled sharply. People online are saying your relationship became emotionally obsessive. Nobody spoke. The atmosphere inside the hospital room suddenly felt suffocating again. Jimin looked away first. Jungkook immediately noticed that reaction. Don't. His voice softened instantly toward him. Don't look at yourself like that. But Jimin already looked crushed. Years of pressure suddenly crashing into one horrifying reality. The world outside was beginning to notice the same emotional imbalance they were only now starting to understand themselves. RM took the phone carefully from Jungkook before things escalated further. Taehyung, listen to me carefully. Stay where you are. Security's coming. Taehyung sounded exhausted now. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. RM sighed heavily. Nobody did. But deep down, everyone knew the damage had already started. Inside the room, Jungkook slowly turned back toward Jimin after RM ended the call. The silence between them now felt heavier than before. Because suddenly, this wasn't just private anymore. Rumors, speculation, judgment. The outside world was getting involved. Jimin quietly pulled the hospital blanket tighter around himself without realizing it. Jungkook noticed that too. Hey, he stepped closer carefully. Look at me. Jimin hesitated before finally doing it. Jungkook lowered his voice immediately. Nothing people say online changes what actually happened. Jimin gave a weak smile filled with exhaustion. But what if they're not completely wrong? That sentence hit Jungkook harder than expected. He stared at Jimin silently for several seconds, then finally asked quietly, Do you really believe loving someone too much is a bad thing? Jimin's eyes softened painfully hearing that question. Not at first. Jungkook looked hurt immediately. Then when? Jimin swallowed hard before answering honestly. When you stop recognizing yourself without them. The room fell silent again. RM quietly looked away to give them privacy, while Jin slowly stepped outside with J-Hope. Nobody wanted to interrupt this conversation anymore. Not after realizing how deep everything truly went, Jungkook sat down slowly beside the bed again. You think that happened to you? Jimin took several seconds before nodding weakly. Jungkook looked down at his hands. Then, maybe it happened to me too. Jimin's eyes widened slightly hearing that. Jungkook laughed softly under his breath, except this time it sounded sad instead of bitter. Do you know what the worst part was tonight? He asked quietly. Jimin stayed silent. Jungkook continued anyway. When they said you collapsed. His voice lowered further. I realized I don't know how to function in a world where something happens to you. Jimin's expression immediately cracked, emotionally, hearing that confession. Jungkook finally looked directly at him again. That scared me. Neither spoke for several seconds after that, because for the first time, both of them were finally saying the things they usually buried. The unhealthy dependence. The fear. The pressure. The emotional panic whenever the other person suffered. It wasn't simple anymore. It never had been. Jimin slowly whispered. Maybe we both forgot where the line was. Jungkook nodded once. Maybe. Another silence settled over the room until suddenly Jungkook asked something unexpected. Did you really mean it? Jimin frowned slightly. Mean what? Jungkook's voice became quieter, more vulnerable. About walking away. Jimin looked down instantly. Long silence. Painful silence. Then, finally, he answered honestly. Part of me thought leaving was the only way to stop hurting. Jungkook's chest tightened immediately hearing that. Jimin quickly continued before he misunderstood. Not because I stopped caring. His eyes filled slightly again. Because I cared too much. Jungkook closed his eyes briefly. Those words somehow hurt worse. Because deep down, he understood exactly what Jimin meant now. Loving someone until your entire emotional stability depends on them stops feeling safe after a while. It starts feeling terrifying. Then suddenly the hospital television mounted quietly in the corner, switched channels automatically after a nurse outside changed the remote. None of them paid attention at first, until J-Hope suddenly rushed back into the room looking alarmed. Turn that off. Everyone looked toward him in confusion. Too late. A new segment had already started playing across the screen. Blurry footage from earlier backstage flashed briefly while dramatic headlines appeared underneath. Rumors of serious conflict inside BTS after member collapse. Jimin's face immediately paled. Jungkook stood up instantly. Then the video played audio from the hallway argument. His own voice echoed loudly through the room. If Jimin dies because of this. Jungkook grabbed the remote immediately and muted the television. But the damage was already done. The room fell into complete silence afterward. Jimin stared toward the dark screen with visible horror in his eyes. Jungkook looked furious again, but this time not at Taehyung, not at reporters, at himself, because now Jimin had to watch his private breakdown become public entertainment. RM quietly cursed under his breath while Jin looked genuinely exhausted beyond words now. This is getting out of control. But the worst part came seconds later. Because Jimin suddenly whispered something so quietly, nobody expected it. They're gonna blame Jungkook for everything. Jungkook turned toward him immediately. I don't care about blame. But Jimin looked terrified now in a completely different way. I do. Jungkook froze, hearing the emotion in his voice. Jimin slowly shook his head while tears threatened again. I can handle people misunderstanding me. His breathing became uneven. But I can't survive watching them turn you into a villain because of me. And at that exact moment, Jungkook finally understood something horrifying. Jimin wasn't trying to walk away because he stopped loving him. He was trying to walk away because he thought loving him was destroying them both. The realization hit Jungkook harder than anything else that night. Jimin wasn't pulling away because his feelings disappeared. He was pulling away because the feelings had become too overwhelming to carry safely anymore. Jungkook stood beside the hospital bed completely silent while Jimin avoided looking directly at him again. The muted television screen still reflected fragments of flashing headlines across the room, making everything feel colder somehow. RM finally turned the television off completely before exhaling heavily. Nobody checks social media tonight, he said firmly. Especially you two. Jimin gave a weak nod, but Jungkook barely reacted. His thoughts were moving too fast now. Every argument from earlier suddenly sounded different in his head. Taehyung warning Jimin about emotional dependence. Jimin crying backstage. The panic in his voice now. None of it came from lack of love, it came from fear. Fear of becoming emotionally trapped inside a relationship where both people were slowly forgetting how to breathe independently. Jungkook slowly sat down again, this time closer to the bed. Closer to Jimin, but careful not to overwhelm him. Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me before it reached this point? He asked quietly. Jimin's eyes lowered instantly. Because I knew you'd try fixing it. And that's bad? Jimin swallowed hard. You always try saving everyone before yourself. Jungkook almost argued immediately. Then stopped, because hearing those words out loud sounded painfully accurate. Jimin looked exhausted now, emotionally drained from finally saying things he'd hidden for months. I started feeling guilty every time you worried about me, he admitted softly. And then I started hiding more things so you wouldn't worry. Jungkook stared at him carefully. That only made things worse. I know. Silence filled the room again, not hostile anymore, just painfully honest. J-Hope quietly moved toward the window while Jin sat beside RM near the door. Nobody interrupted, because they all understood this conversation needed to happen completely. Even if it hurt. Jungkook rubbed his hands together slowly before finally speaking again. Do you know what scares me the most? Jimin looked at him weakly. Jungkook's voice dropped lower. That you reached a point where collapsing felt easier than talking to me honestly. Jimin's expression immediately cracked hearing that sentence. Because deep down, part of it was true, not intentionally, not consciously. But Jimin had buried so much emotional pressure inside himself that eventually his body forced everything to stop. Jimin looked away again, guilt washing across his face. I never wanted to hurt you, Jungkook answered almost instantly. Then stop trying to disappear every time things become difficult. Jimin looked stunned hearing the emotion in his voice. Jungkook leaned forward slightly now, exhaustion visible everywhere across his face too. You think leaving protects me, he continued quietly. But watching you destroy yourself, silently, hurts worse. Jimin's eyes slowly filled again. RM quietly exchanged a glance with Jin, because for the first time tonight, Jungkook no longer sounded angry. He sounded terrified. and honest. Then suddenly Jungkook asked the one question nobody expected. "Did you ever plan on telling me goodbye?" The room froze. Jimin looked shocked immediately. "What?" Jungkook held his gaze carefully. "Before tonight." Jimin's breathing became uneven again. "No." But the hesitation before answering was enough. Jungkook noticed instantly. "You thought about it." Jimin closed his eyes tightly for a second. "Only when things felt overwhelming." Jungkook looked completely shattered hearing that. "Jimin." Jimin's voice cracked softly now. "I didn't want to lose you." "Then why think about leaving?" Jimin finally looked directly at him again, despite the tears threatening in his eyes. "Because I thought maybe you'd finally breathe easier without carrying me too." That sentence broke something inside Jungkook immediately. He moved instinctively closer before stopping himself again halfway. The hesitation alone hurt Jimin too, because for the first time, even comfort between them felt uncertain. Fragile. Dangerous. Jungkook noticed that reaction immediately, so this time instead of touching him, he simply spoke softly. "You were never a burden." Jimin looked emotionally wrecked hearing that. "Then why do I feel like one all the time?" Nobody in the room had an answer. Because emotional exhaustion rarely follows logic. Jimin spent so long carrying pressure quietly that eventually he convinced himself his pain only complicated everyone else's lives. Especially Jungkook's. The silence stretched painfully until Suga finally entered the room after returning from a phone call outside. One look at everyone's faces told him enough already. "Management wants all members back at the hotel before sunrise," he said calmly. RM nodded tiredly. "Media pressure? And safety concerns." Suga looked toward Jungkook and Jimin carefully. "Things online are escalating fast." Jimin immediately looked tense again. Jungkook noticed and answered before anyone else could. "He's not checking anything." Suga nodded once approvingly. "Good." Then he paused briefly before adding something unexpected. "But there's another issue." Everyone looked toward him instantly. Suga crossed his arms quietly. Someone from the staff leaked details about Jimin and Taehyung arguing backstage before the performance. Taehyung's name immediately changed the atmosphere again. Jungkook's jaw tightened automatically while Jimin looked worried. "What kind of details?" RM asked carefully. Suga exhaled slowly. "Enough for people online to start blaming Taehyung for the collapse too." Jimin immediately pushed himself upward, despite obvious exhaustion. "No." Jungkook turned toward him instantly. "Relax. This is my fault." Jimin whispered desperately. "Everyone's getting hurt because of me." Jungkook moved closer immediately now, no hesitation this time. "Stop saying that." Jimin looked overwhelmed. "But it's true." "No." Jungkook's voice became firmer. "What's happening right now is the result of months of pressure nobody handled properly." Jimin stared at him silently. Jungkook continued carefully. "Including me." That honesty immediately softened Jimin's expression again. Then suddenly, the hospital room door opened unexpectedly before anyone could continue. Taehyung stepped inside. Every person in the room immediately looked shocked. His hair looked messy from rushing outside. His face looked pale, and the moment his eyes landed on Jimin lying weakly in the hospital bed, the guilt across Taehyung's expression became impossible to hide anymore. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. The room stayed silent. Taehyung slowly looked toward Jungkook next. "I shouldn't have pushed him that hard tonight." Jungkook didn't answer immediately. The tension between them still felt dangerous. But before anyone else could speak, Taehyung suddenly continued with something that changed the atmosphere instantly. "But there's something all of you still don't know." RM frowned immediately. "What now?" Taehyung looked directly toward Jimin first like he was silently apologizing. Then finally he spoke. "Jimin wasn't the only one thinking about walking away recently." The room froze. Jungkook's expression changed instantly. Slowly, carefully, like his mind already feared the answer before hearing it. Then Taehyung quietly finished the sentence that made the entire atmosphere collapse all over again. Jungkook almost left too. The silence after Taehyung's confession felt almost unreal. Nobody in the hospital room moved for several seconds. Jimin stared at Jungkook in complete shock, while RM immediately looked toward Taehyung with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Jin asked quietly. But Taehyung never looked away from Jungkook. "Tell them!" Jungkook's expression hardened instantly. "This isn't the time." "Then when?" Taehyung fired back softly. "After everything breaks completely?" Jimin slowly turned toward Jungkook again, confusion and fear mixing together across his exhausted face. What does he mean? Jungkook looked trapped now, cornered emotionally in a way nobody had ever seen before. Suga immediately noticed it too. "Jungkook!" His voice stayed calm. "Is he telling the truth?" Long silence. Painful silence. Then finally Jungkook nodded once. Jimin's face lost color instantly. "You were gonna leave?" Jungkook rubbed both hands across his face in frustration before finally answering. "Not the group." Jimin looked even more confused now. "Then what?" Jungkook lowered his eyes toward the floor. "Everything else." Nobody understood immediately, except Taehyung, and judging from his expression, he hated knowing this secret. Jungkook exhaled shakily before continuing. "A few weeks ago," he paused briefly, "I started thinking maybe everyone around me would breathe easier if I disappeared for a while." RM looked stunned hearing that. "Why would you think that?" Jungkook laughed quietly under his breath without humor. "Because no matter how hard I worked, it still felt like people around me kept getting hurt." Jimin stared at him silently now, emotions visibly crashing across his face all over again. Jungkook slowly continued. "The pressure became too much." His voice lowered further. "Schedules, expectations, constant criticism online, watching everyone around me exhausted." He swallowed hard, including Jimin. The room stayed completely silent, because suddenly the situation looked far more complicated than anyone realized earlier. Jimin wasn't the only one silently drowning. Jungkook had been collapsing emotionally too, just differently. Taehyung finally spoke quietly. "That's why I got angry." Everyone looked toward him. Taehyung's eyes shifted between Jungkook and Jimin carefully. "You were both destroying yourselves trying to protect each other." Nobody denied it. Because now it felt painfully obvious. Jimin carried Jungkook emotionally until he forgot himself. Jungkook carried guilt and pressure until he started believing isolation was the only solution. Two people trying desperately to save one another while slowly falling apart individually. Jimin's eyes slowly filled again. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jungkook looked shattered hearing that question because he realized instantly the cruel irony of it. He spent the entire night asking Jimin the same thing. Jungkook finally answered quietly.
"Because I knew you'd blame yourself." Jimin immediately looked away, exactly like Jungkook predicted. RM sighed heavily while leaning back against the wall. "So both of you kept hiding your pain to protect the other person." Suga crossed his arms silently, and now everyone's surprised things exploded. Nobody argued with him, because he was right. The signs had been everywhere. J-Hope looked exhausted now too. "You two really thought carrying everything alone was helping." Jungkook gave a weak smile. "At the time, yeah." Jimin whispered softly, "Me too." The room fell quiet again until Taehyung slowly stepped closer toward the hospital bed. "That's why I pushed you tonight," he admitted toward Jimin. "Because I was scared watching both of you disappear emotionally in front of everyone." Jungkook finally looked directly at Taehyung again. The anger was still there, but now something else existed too. Understanding, reluctant understanding. "You handled it badly," Jungkook muttered. Taehyung nodded immediately. "I know." Jimin looked emotionally exhausted hearing all of this at once. Too many truths, too many emotions finally dragged into the open after months of silence. He slowly covered his eyes with one trembling hand. "I hate this." Jungkook immediately moved closer instinctively. "Hey!" Jimin shook his head weakly. "Everything feels broken now." Jungkook's expression softened painfully hearing that. "No!" Jimin laughed bitterly under his breath. "Look around." His voice cracked slightly. "Everyone's hurt." Nobody spoke because nobody could deny it anymore. The emotional damage inside the group had spread further than any of them realized. Then suddenly RM's phone rang loudly again. He answered quickly before stepping toward the corner of the room. The second his expression changed, everyone noticed. "What happened?" Jin asked carefully. RM lowered the phone slowly after ending the call. Management wants an emergency meeting. Suga frowned. Right now. RM nodded grimly. They're worried the rumors online are turning into something bigger. Jungkook looked irritated immediately. We're at a hospital. I know. RM looked exhausted beyond words now, but investors and media outlets are already contacting the company. Jimin's face immediately tightened with guilt again. Jungkook noticed instantly and cut in sharply before he could spiral further. None of this is your fault. But Jimin whispered quietly, it started because of me. Jungkook looked directly into his eyes. No, his voice became firmer now. It started because all of us ignored what was happening for too long. That sentence silenced the room completely, because it was true. Everyone had noticed pieces of the problem. Nobody faced it fully until everything collapsed publicly. RM finally sighed heavily. The company wants statements prepared in case more footage leaks. Taehyung immediately looked tense again. What kind of statements? RM hesitated briefly. Another terrible sign. Damage control. Jungkook's expression darkened instantly. Meaning, RM answered carefully. They want to present tonight as a misunderstanding caused by exhaustion. Jimin frowned weakly. That's not completely wrong. No, RM admitted. But they also want everyone avoiding personal questions about relationships inside the group. The atmosphere shifted again instantly. Jungkook looked away sharply while Taehyung stayed silent. Because suddenly another terrifying reality appeared. Public image, company pressure. The possibility of being forced to hide the emotional truth all over again. Jimin slowly whispered, so we go back to pretending. Nobody answered, because that was exactly what management wanted. Jungkook finally spoke after several seconds of silence. I can't do that anymore. RM looked toward him carefully. Jungkook. No. Jungkook shook his head firmly now. Maybe we don't tell the world every detail. Fine. He looked toward Jimin briefly before continuing. But I'm done acting like everything's okay when it's not. Jimin stared at him quietly. Something in Jungkook's voice sounded different now. Less afraid, more honest. Taehyung noticed it too. Then suddenly another knock interrupted the room before anyone could continue. A staff member stepped inside nervously. There's people downstairs trying to enter the hospital lobby. RM frowned immediately. Fans! The staff member looked uncomfortable. And reporters. Jin cursed quietly under his breath. J-Hope rubbed his forehead again. This night seriously never ends. But the worst part came seconds later when the staff member added one final sentence. Someone online posted that Jungkook and Jimin were fighting over Taehyung before the collapse. The room instantly froze again. Jungkook looked furious. Jimin looked horrified. Taehyung closed his eyes tightly in frustration. Because now the outside world was turning their emotional breakdown into entertainment. And none of them were ready for how ugly things were about to become. The room erupted into tense, overlapping voices almost immediately after hearing the rumor. What? Jin looked genuinely stunned, while J-Hope immediately grabbed his phone despite RM telling everyone not to check social media. Don't, RM warned sharply. Too late, Suga muttered quietly after seeing J-Hope's expression darken. Jungkook's jaw tightened dangerously while Jimin looked like he could barely breathe properly again. They think this is some kind of jealousy fight, Jimin whispered weakly. The staff member nodded awkwardly. People are spreading clips without context. Taehyung laughed bitterly under his breath. Of course they are. Jungkook suddenly stood up so fast his chair scraped violently across the hospital floor. I'm done with this. RM immediately stepped in front of him. And where exactly are you going? To shut this down. By doing what? RM's voice became firmer. Marching into a crowd while emotional and exhausted. Jungkook looked furious now. They're turning Jimin into gossip while he's in a hospital bed. Jimin quietly spoke before things escalated further. Jungkook. That single word instantly softened his expression slightly. Jimin slowly shook his head. Don't make this worse for yourself too. Jungkook looked completely torn now, because every instinct inside him wanted to protect Jimin from the chaos outside. But every emotional decision tonight had already created more damage. Taehyung suddenly stepped forward unexpectedly. I'll make a statement. Everyone looked toward him instantly. RM frowned immediately. Absolutely not. Why? Taehyung asked quietly. Because right now emotions are controlling every decision we make. RM rubbed both hands over his face in exhaustion before continuing. One wrong sentence and this situation explodes further. Taehyung clenched his jaw tightly. Then what's the plan? Sit quietly while people attack everyone online. Nobody answered immediately because there wasn't a good solution. Not tonight. Jimin suddenly spoke again, his voice weaker now from emotional exhaustion. Maybe they should blame me. Jungkook turned toward him instantly. Don't say that. Why not? Jimin whispered. At least then everyone else stops getting dragged into this. Jungkook looked genuinely hurt hearing that. You still think protecting everyone means sacrificing yourself first. Jimin looked away silently, because he knew Jungkook was right. Suga finally moved closer to the bed, his voice calm but serious. Jimin slowly looked up. You collapsing doesn't make you responsible for everyone else's reactions. Jimin gave a tired smile that barely existed. That doesn't stop me from feeling responsible. Suga nodded once quietly. I know. The room fell silent again until suddenly Jungkook asked something unexpected toward Taehyung. When did you find out? Taehyung looked confused briefly. About what? About me wanting to disappear for a while. Taehyung hesitated before answering honestly. A month ago. RM immediately looked surprised. A month? Jungkook slowly lowered his eyes toward the floor. Taehyung continued carefully. I found him alone after rehearsals one night. The room stayed silent while Taehyung explained. He looked exhausted, worse than normal. Jungkook closed his eyes briefly like he already regretted where this conversation was going. I asked if he was okay, Taehyung continued quietly, and he laughed. Jimin immediately looked toward Jungkook hearing that. Taehyung's voice lowered further. Then he said maybe everyone around him would finally relax if he disappeared for a while. Jimin's face slowly fell apart emotionally hearing those words repeated out loud. Jungkook rubbed both hands over his face again, visibly ashamed now. I didn't mean it seriously. Taehyung answered instantly. That's the problem. The tension shifted again immediately. Not angry now, painful, heavy. You sounded serious enough that I couldn't stop thinking about it afterward, Taehyung admitted. Especially after watching Jimin slowly fall apart too. RM leaned back against the wall quietly, processing everything. So you were trying to separate them emotionally before something worse happened. Taehyung nodded once. I thought if they depended on each other less. He stopped talking briefly before finishing softly. Maybe both of them would survive the pressure better. Jungkook looked conflicted now. Because despite everything, part of him understood the logic too. Jimin whispered quietly, you should have talked to us together. Taehyung immediately looked guilty. I know. J-Hope finally sighed deeply from near the window. This entire situation feels like everyone tried protecting each other in the worst possible ways. Nobody argued with that, because it was true. Every emotional decision came from fear. Fear of losing someone, fear of burdening others, fear of becoming emotionally trapped. Fear of not being enough, and now all those fears were exploding publicly. Then suddenly Jimin's phone buzzed softly on the bedside table. Everyone immediately looked toward it. RM frowned. Ignore it! But Jimin had already seen the screen light up. His expression changed instantly. Jungkook noticed first. What is it? Jimin hesitated. Another dangerous hesitation. Jungkook stepped closer. Jimin. Jimin slowly picked up the phone with trembling fingers before quietly whispering, It's my mother. The room immediately softened slightly. Jin looked relieved at first. Then answer. But Jimin didn't move. Jungkook frowned carefully. What's wrong? Jimin stared at the screen silently before finally admitting the truth. I didn't tell my family I was struggling either. That sentence crushed the atmosphere all over again. Jungkook closed his eyes briefly in frustration while RM looked genuinely saddened now. Jimin laughed weakly under his breath. They probably found out through the news. Nobody knew what to say to that, because suddenly the emotional isolation surrounding Jimin felt even worse than before. Not just hiding from members, from everyone. Jungkook slowly reached toward the phone first. Do you want me to answer? Jimin immediately shook his head. No. He swallowed hard before finally pressing accept. The second his mother's worried voice filled the room speaker softly, Jimin's expression nearly collapsed emotionally again. Jimin! Her voice sounded panicked already. Are you all right? Jimin forced himself to answer steadily despite everything. I'm okay. Jungkook looked away instantly after hearing that lie again. Jimin's mother sounded close to tears now. Why didn't you tell us you were sick? Jimin stayed silent, because he had no answer anymore. Then suddenly his mother quietly asked something that stunned the entire room. Did something happen between you and Jungkook? Every member froze instantly. Jimin looked horrified. Jungkook's eyes widened slightly too. The silence that followed felt endless before Jimin finally whispered weakly, Why would you ask that? His mother answered softly, painfully gently. Because whenever you sound this broken, it's usually connected to him. Nobody in the room knew how to react after hearing that. And for the first time all night, Jungkook truly realized how visible their emotional dependence had become even to the people closest to them. The room stayed completely silent after Jimin's mother said those words. Even the quiet hospital machines suddenly felt louder beneath the crushing tension. Jimin looked frozen, holding the phone against his ear, while Jungkook slowly lowered his eyes toward the floor again. Nobody knew how to react because the truth inside that sentence hurt too much. Whenever you sound this broken, it's usually connected to him. Jimin's breathing became uneven, while his mother continued softly from the other end of the call. "Jimin," he quickly forced himself to answer before she worried more. "I'm here." His voice sounded fragile now despite trying to stay calm. "Did you and Jungkook fight?" she asked carefully. Jimin immediately glanced toward Jungkook for half a second before looking away again. "Not exactly." His mother sighed softly. "Then what happened?" Jimin opened his mouth to answer. Nothing came out because how could he explain this? Months of emotional exhaustion, fear, dependence, pressure. Love becoming so overwhelming it started hurting both people involved. There were no simple words for any of it. Jungkook finally stepped closer quietly. "Tell her you're safe first." Jimin looked up at him immediately after hearing the gentleness in his voice. Then he whispered back into the phone, "I'm okay now, really." His mother sounded unconvinced. "You collapsed." Jimin closed his eyes briefly. "I was tired." Jungkook almost reacted instantly hearing that familiar excuse again, but stopped himself this time. Because he knew Jimin wasn't trying to lie maliciously. Hiding pain had simply become automatic. His mother stayed quiet for several seconds before asking softly, "Were you carrying everything alone again?" Jimin's eyes slowly filled hearing that question. Because suddenly it became painfully obvious this wasn't new behavior. Even his family recognized the pattern. Jimin whispered weakly, "Maybe." The call continued quietly for another few minutes while the members respectfully gave him space, but the atmosphere inside the room had already changed again. Jungkook leaned against the wall silently, replaying every conversation from tonight in his head. Taehyung watched him carefully from across the room before eventually speaking in a lower voice only he could hear. "You finally understand now, don't you?" Jungkook didn't answer immediately, then quietly asked, "Understand what?" Taehyung's expression softened sadly. "That Jimin wasn't pulling away because he stopped loving you." Jungkook looked down slowly. "Yeah." His voice sounded tired now, broken in a quieter way. Taehyung hesitated briefly before continuing. "And you weren't trying to disappear because you stopped caring about everyone either." Jungkook gave a weak, humorless smile. "We really handled everything horribly." Taehyung nodded once immediately. "Definitely." For the first time all night, there was no anger between them during those few seconds. Just exhaustion, regret, shared guilt. Then suddenly Jimin ended the phone call and quietly placed the phone back onto the bedside table. The second the call ended, the emotional exhaustion on his face returned even stronger. Jungkook immediately noticed. "You okay?" Jimin gave a weak nod. Nobody believed it. RM finally stepped forward carefully. "You need actual rest now." Jimin looked toward him apologetically. "Sorry for causing all this trouble." Almost every member reacted immediately. "Stop apologizing," Jin said firmly. J-Hope nodded quickly too. "Seriously." Suga crossed his arms while looking directly at Jimin. "You collapsing is not an inconvenience to us." Jimin looked visibly emotional hearing that because deep down he truly believed his pain only complicated other people's lives. Jungkook slowly sat beside the bed again. "Listen to them." Jimin stared quietly at the blanket covering him instead. Then suddenly he whispered something nobody expected. "I think I forgot how to ask for help." The sentence hit every person inside the room differently. RM looked heartbroken. Jin immediately looked away. Taehyung closed his eyes briefly, but Jungkook looked devastated, because suddenly he realized just how lonely Jimin must have felt for a long time now, surrounded by people who loved him deeply. Yet still emotionally isolated because he convinced himself his struggles were burdens. Jungkook lowered his voice carefully. "You never have to earn support from us." Jimin looked toward him slowly. Jungkook continued before fear could stop him. "And you don't have to keep proving your worth by sacrificing yourself first." Jimin's expression cracked emotionally again, because deep down that was exactly what he'd been doing. For years. Then suddenly another knock interrupted the moment again. This time the doctor stepped inside with a more serious expression than before. Everyone immediately straightened slightly. "I need the patient resting soon," the doctor said calmly. RM nodded quickly. "Of course." But the doctor wasn't finished. "There's also another concern." The atmosphere tightened immediately. Jungkook frowned. "What concern?" The doctor glanced briefly at Jimin's chart before answering carefully. "His stress levels are still dangerously high." Jimin immediately looked uncomfortable while the members stayed silent. The doctor continued. "If this emotional pressure continues unchecked, recovery will become much harder." Jungkook's jaw tightened again hearing that. "So what happens now?" The doctor answered honestly. "He needs distance from stressful environments temporarily." Jimin looked nervous instantly. "What does that mean?" The doctor chose his words carefully. "Less public pressure, less emotional conflict, more stability." Nobody missed the uncomfortable implication behind those words. Jungkook certainly didn't. Jimin slowly looked toward him again with visible fear building inside his eyes, because suddenly the question they avoided all night returned stronger than ever. Were they actually good for each other right now? The doctor eventually left the room after reminding everyone again that Jimin needed proper rest, but the silence afterward became unbearable. Jimin quietly whispered first, "Maybe the doctor's right." Jungkook immediately looked at him sharply. "Don't." Jimin's voice weakened further. "Everything becomes heavier emotionally when we're around each other lately." Jungkook stared at him in disbelief. "So what? We just walk away." Jimin looked torn apart internally now. "I don't know." Taehyung quietly looked away because this was exactly the fear he tried warning them about earlier. Jungkook slowly stood up from beside the bed again, this time packing once across the room before speaking. "Every solution tonight sounds like losing each other." Nobody answered, because that was exactly why this situation felt impossible. Jimin looked down silently while Jungkook continued in frustration. "Stay close and we drown emotionally." He laughed bitterly again. "Pull apart and it still hurts." RM finally spoke quietly after listening for too long. "Maybe the problem isn't closeness." Everyone looked toward him. RM continued carefully. "Maybe the problem is both of you believing love means carrying pain alone." The room went silent again, because once again he was right. Jungkook slowly stopped packing. Jimin looked emotionally exhausted hearing all these truths out loud one after another. Then suddenly Jungkook's phone buzzed loudly again. Everyone looked toward him instantly. His expression changed the second he checked the screen. RM noticed immediately. "What happened?" Jungkook looked stunned now. "Someone leaked another video." Jin groaned quietly under his breath. "What now?" Jungkook slowly looked up from the phone, disbelief spreading across his face. "It's footage from backstage." Jimin's expression immediately tightened with panic. "Which footage?" Jungkook hesitated. And somehow that hesitation already felt terrifying. Then he quietly answered with the words that made Jimin's face completely lose color. "The moment you told me you were scared of losing yourself." The room exploded into stunned silence. Jimin looked completely frozen on the hospital bed while Jungkook stared down at the phone screen in disbelief. "No," Jimin whispered weakly. "No, no." His breathing immediately became uneven again. RM stepped forward quickly. "Don't look at it." But Jungkook already had. And judging from his expression, the leaked footage was worse than anyone expected. Jin immediately grabbed the phone from his hand before Jimin could panic further. Second Jin watched a few seconds of the clip, his face hardened instantly. "Turn this off." J-Hope frowned nervously. "How bad is it?" Jin looked genuinely disturbed now. "The audio's clear." Nobody spoke, because they all understood immediately what that meant. Private emotions, vulnerable conversations, raw confessions never meant for the public. Jimin slowly covered his face with both hands while shame visibly crashed over him all at once. "I can't do this." Jungkook immediately moved closer. "Hey," but Jimin shook his head quickly. "People heard everything." His voice sounded panicked now. "They heard me say I was losing myself." Jungkook's chest tightened painfully hearing the fear in his voice. "That doesn't make you weak." Jimin laughed softly under his breath, except it sounded broken. "You know how people online are." Nobody argued because everyone knew he was right. The internet rarely treated emotional vulnerability gently, especially not from people constantly living under public pressure. RM quietly checked his own phone after Jin handed it over. The second he read the reactions spreading online, his expression darkened immediately. "Management's going to panic." Suga looked toward him carefully. "What are people saying?" RM exhaled slowly. "Half the internet thinks this is proof of secret member conflict." He paused briefly. The other half thinks Jungkook emotionally manipulated Jimin. The room instantly turned cold. Jungkook looked furious. Jimin looked horrified. Taehyung immediately stepped forward. That's not true, RM nodded quickly. I know. But online rumors no longer cared about truth once narratives started spreading emotionally. Jungkook ran one frustrated hand through his hair before packing sharply across the room. This is insane. Jimin watched him silently, guilt growing across his face all over again. Jungkook noticed instantly and stopped walking. Don't. Jimin whispered weakly, this happened because of me. No. Jungkook's voice became firm again immediately. This happened because people keep invading private moments they don't understand. But Jimin still looked devastated. They're attacking you. Jungkook stared at him carefully before finally saying the one thing nobody expected. Then let them. The room went silent. Jimin slowly looked up. Jungkook's voice lowered now, calmer but far more serious. I'm tired of watching you carry every emotional hit alone. Jimin's eyes softened painfully hearing that. Jungkook continued carefully. If people misunderstand me protecting you, I honestly don't care anymore. RM frowned slightly. Jungkook. But Jungkook didn't stop. No. He looked toward everyone in the room now. Tonight proved exactly why Jimin keeps hiding everything. His jaw tightened again. Because the second he finally breaks honestly, people turn it into gossip. Nobody argued with him, because once again, he wasn't wrong. Jimin slowly lowered his hands from his face now, though his eyes still looked overwhelmed. I never wanted our relationship to become something heavy. Jungkook immediately answered softly. It didn't become heavy because we cared about each other. He paused briefly. It became heavy because we stopped being honest when things hurt. That sentence stayed hanging in the room for several seconds. Taehyung quietly looked down after hearing it because deep inside, he knew secrecy was what made everything spiral out of control, not love itself. Then suddenly RM's phone rang again. This time he looked irritated before even answering. What now? Everyone watched his expression carefully during the short conversation. The more RM listened, the worse his face became. Finally, he ended the call and sighed heavily. Management's coming here. Jin immediately frowned. To the hospital. RM nodded once. I want to speak privately with Jungkook and Jimin before any statements get released. J-Hope muttered quietly under his breath. Here we go. The atmosphere instantly became tense again, because everyone knew what management cared about most during scandals. Public image, damage control, containment. Jimin looked exhausted just hearing it. I don't want to do interviews. RM quickly reassured him. Nobody's forcing you tonight. But his voice lacked confidence. Jungkook immediately noticed. What aren't you saying? RM hesitated, another terrible sign. They're worried public speculation about emotional dependence could damage future activities. The room froze again. Jungkook's expression darkened immediately. Are they serious? RM looked uncomfortable now. They think people might misinterpret things. Taehyung laughed bitterly. People are already misinterpreting things. Suga crossed his arms quietly. So what's their solution? RM finally answered carefully. They might recommend temporary distance between Jungkook and Jimin publicly. Silence crushed the room instantly. Jimin looked like someone physically hit him. Jungkook stared at RM in disbelief. What? RM quickly raised both hands slightly. I'm only telling you what they're discussing. Jungkook's voice became dangerously calm. They think separating us fixes this. Nobody answered. Because deep down, everyone understood how cruel that idea sounded after everything revealed tonight. Jimin slowly looked down toward the hospital blanket again while emotion visibly built behind his exhausted expression. Jungkook noticed instantly. Hey! Jimin didn't look up. Maybe they're right. Jungkook froze completely. Don't say that. Jimin finally whispered the fear destroying him inside. Every time we get too emotionally close lately, something breaks. Jungkook stepped closer immediately. That's not because we care about each other. Jimin's voice cracked harder now. Then why does everything hurt so much? Nobody in the room had an easy answer. Because healing emotional dependence wasn't simple. Love didn't magically erase exhaustion, and distance didn't magically erase fear either. Taehyung quietly spoke for the first time in several minutes. Maybe the real problem is neither of you knows how to exist without trying to save the other person constantly. Jungkook looked frustrated again but didn't deny it. Because after tonight, he couldn't. Jimin closed his eyes briefly while tears slipped down silently despite trying to stay composed. I'm tired, he whispered weakly. The room immediately softened again hearing how emotionally exhausted he sounded now. Jungkook sat carefully beside the bed once more, lowering his voice instantly. Then stop fighting alone. Jimin slowly looked toward him again. Jungkook's eyes looked just as tired now too. We figure this out together. Jimin stared at him silently for several long seconds, then finally whispered the question both of them feared most. What if together is exactly what's hurting us? Jungkook opened his mouth to answer immediately. But before he could say a single word, the hospital room door suddenly opened hard. Every member turned instantly toward the entrance. And the second they saw the expressions on management's faces, everyone realized the situation outside had already become far worse than they imagined. The atmosphere inside the hospital room changed instantly the moment management entered. Nobody even needed explanations yet. The tension on their faces already said enough. One senior manager closed the door carefully behind him before looking directly at Jungkook and Jimin. We need to talk privately. Jungkook's expression hardened immediately. Whatever you need to say can be said here. The manager hesitated briefly after noticing the emotional exhaustion covering the entire room. But eventually, he nodded once. Fine. RM quietly stepped aside while the others remained tense and silent. Jimin looked drained already, leaning weakly against the hospital bed while Jungkook instinctively stayed close beside him again. The manager exhaled slowly before speaking. The situation online escalated faster than expected. Suga crossed his arms quietly. We noticed. Another manager placed a tablet down carefully on the nearby table. Multiple media outlets are now framing tonight as an emotional conflict involving member relationships. Taehyung looked irritated instantly. Because people are twisting private moments without context. Context doesn't matter once public narratives spread, the manager answered bluntly. Jungkook immediately looked furious hearing that. So what exactly are you trying to say? The room fell silent briefly before the senior manager finally answered. Right now, the company's priority is protecting the group's stability. Jimin quietly lowered his eyes after hearing those words, because deep down he already knew what was coming next. Jungkook noticed immediately and stepped slightly closer toward him. Say it directly. The manager looked uncomfortable now. We strongly recommend reducing visible emotional dependency between both of you publicly for a while. Nobody spoke. The silence afterward felt crushing. Jimin stared toward the blanket covering him while Jungkook looked genuinely stunned for the first time all night. You can't be serious. The manager continued carefully. This isn't punishment. Jungkook laughed bitterly under his breath. Then what is it? RM quietly rubbed his forehead while Jin looked frustrated already. Nobody liked where this conversation was heading. The manager tried again. Public perception is becoming dangerous. For who? Jungkook snapped immediately. The company. For everyone. The answer came fast this time. People online are already accusing Jungkook of emotional control and accusing Jimin of instability. Jimin visibly flinched hearing those words out loud. Jungkook noticed instantly. Enough! His voice became sharper. He doesn't need to hear this right now. But the manager continued anyway. The more emotionally attached you appear publicly after tonight, the worse speculation becomes. Taehyung looked away immediately, while J-Hope muttered quietly under his breath, already having every second of this discussion. Jungkook slowly shook his head in disbelief. So your solution is pretending we suddenly don't care about each other? The manager answered calmly. Our solution is creating healthier boundaries before public pressure destroys both of you emotionally. That sentence silenced the room unexpectedly, because underneath the cold corporate language, part of it sounded painfully true. Jimin quietly whispered first, maybe they're not completely wrong. Jungkook turned toward him instantly. Jimin still couldn't meet his eyes properly. Tonight proved how bad things became. Jungkook looked hurt hearing him agree even slightly. You think distancing ourselves fixes this? Jimin's voice sounded exhausted now. I don't know what fixes this anymore. The honesty in that answer hurt worse than anger. RM finally stepped in before emotions exploded again. Nobody making decisions tonight. The manager nodded once. Of course. But his expression clearly said the company already had expectations forming behind the scenes. Suga suddenly spoke quietly from near the wall. You're treating emotional burnout like a public relations issue. The manager looked toward him carefully. Because right now it became both. Nobody liked that answer either, especially Jungkook. He stared toward the managers with visible frustration growing again. Do you know what's actually dangerous? The room looked toward him. Jungkook's voice lowered now, calm but intense, forcing people to hide emotional problems until they collapse publicly. Silence followed immediately. Even the managers had no response for several seconds, because once again, he wasn't wrong. Jimin quietly looked toward Jungkook after hearing that. Something emotional shifted softly across his exhausted face. Like hearing someone finally defend honesty instead of image control reached him deeper than expected. Then suddenly, one of the managers carefully changed direction. "We're not asking either of you to stop caring about each other." Jungkook immediately answered. "That's exactly what this feels like." "No," the manager sighed quietly. "We're saying your emotional dependence became visible enough that even people outside the group noticed." Jimin slowly closed his eyes hearing that because it echoed exactly what his mother accidentally revealed earlier too. Everyone saw it. Everyone noticed how deeply connected their emotional stability had become, even when they tried hiding it. The manager continued carefully. "If this continues without boundaries," he paused briefly, "neither of you will recover properly." The room became quiet again, heavier this time, because now the conversation wasn't about blame anymore. It was about survival. Emotional survival. Jungkook slowly sat beside the hospital bed again, exhaustion finally overtaking some of his anger. "Then tell me something honestly." The manager looked toward him cautiously. Jungkook's voice lowered further. "If Jimin collapsed tonight from pressure and emotional burnout," he glanced toward Jimin briefly before continuing. "Why is everyone's first instinct still protecting public image instead of protecting him?" Nobody answered immediately. Even RM looked uncomfortable. Because despite understanding management's fears, the truth inside Jungkook's question felt impossible to ignore. Jimin quietly whispered without looking up, "Because public image affects everyone." Jungkook immediately turned toward him again. "And there you go doing it again." Jimin frowned weakly. "What? Protecting everyone else first." Jimin fell silent. Jungkook leaned forward slightly now, speaking softer but more directly. "You're lying in a hospital bed exhausted out of your mind, and somehow you're still worrying more about other people's problems than your own." Jimin's eyes slowly filled again hearing that. Nobody interrupted because deep down every member knew Jungkook was exposing the exact emotional pattern destroying Jimin quietly for years. Then suddenly Taehyung spoke carefully. "He's not the only one." The room looked toward him. Taehyung's eyes shifted toward Jungkook. "You do the same thing differently." Jungkook looked irritated instantly. "This isn't about me." "That's exactly the problem," Taehyung answered quietly. "Neither of you knows how to stop carrying everything alone." Another painful silence followed. Jimin slowly whispered, "We made each other worse." Jungkook looked shocked hearing him say that out loud. "No." Jimin finally forced himself to meet his eyes directly again despite how emotionally wrecked he looked. "We made each other survive." His voice cracked softly. "But maybe we forgot how to heal." The room went completely silent after that, because for the first time all night, someone finally separated survival from healing. And suddenly everyone realized the terrifying truth. Jungkook and Jimin had spent so long emotionally saving each other from collapsing that neither noticed they were both still deeply hurting underneath. Then one of the managers carefully spoke again. "That's why boundaries matter now." Jungkook looked away sharply. He hated hearing corporate language attached to something this personal, but part of him also understood the fear behind it now. Jimin looked exhausted beyond words after everything tonight, emotionally raw, vulnerable in ways the public was never supposed to see. Then suddenly the senior manager added one final sentence that changed the atmosphere all over again. "There's another issue." RM immediately frowned. "What now?" The manager hesitated awkwardly. "Someone leaked older internal reports about emotional concerns between members." Jungkook's expression darkened instantly. "What reports?" The manager looked directly toward him and Jimin before answering carefully. "Private staff observations." Jimin's face slowly lost color again. Jungkook stood up immediately. "You documented us." Nobody answered right away, and somehow that silence already felt like betrayal. "You documented us," Jungkook repeated slowly, his voice dangerously calm now. The silence inside the hospital room became suffocating instantly. Jimin looked completely stunned while RM immediately stepped forward after noticing the shift in Jungkook's expression. One of the managers quickly tried to explain. "Internal wellness observations are standard during stressful promotion periods." "Don't." Jungkook cut him off sharply. "Don't make this sound normal." His jaw tightened harder with every word. You were monitoring our emotional relationship. The manager hesitated again. Another terrible sign. Concerns were raised over time regarding emotional dependence and burnout risks. Jimin slowly lowered his eyes after hearing those words because suddenly everything made horrifying sense. The worried glances from staff, schedule adjustments, quiet conversations stopping whenever he or Jungkook entered certain rooms. People noticed far more than either of them realized. Jungkook laughed bitterly under his breath again. So everyone knew we were falling apart before we did. Nobody answered immediately. That silence hurt worse than confirmation. Taehyung quietly looked away while Jin rubbed both hands over his face in frustration. Suga's expression darkened too. And nobody thought maybe actually helping them mattered more than writing reports. The managers looked uncomfortable now. We tried minimizing stress. By increasing secrecy, Suga answered coldly. Great strategy. Jimin suddenly whispered quietly from the bed. What exactly was written? Every person in the room looked toward him instantly. The manager looked hesitant. Jimin, I asked a question. His voice sounded weak physically but emotionally steady for the first time in hours. The manager slowly exhaled before answering carefully. Concerns about emotional overreliance. Jimin's face remained unreadable. And signs of unhealthy self-sacrifice patterns. Jungkook immediately looked furious again hearing that language directed toward Jimin. But the manager wasn't finished. Concerns that both of you were prioritizing each other's emotional stability over your own mental recovery. The room fell silent, because deep down nobody could deny those observations anymore. Jimin slowly stared toward the blanket again, while emotion visibly built across his exhausted expression. Jungkook immediately noticed. Stop looking at yourself like you're broken. Jimin whispered back quietly, maybe I am. Jungkook's face tightened instantly. No, but Jimin continued anyway. Normal people don't collapse because they forgot how to handle their emotions. Jungkook stepped closer immediately. You collapsed because you carried too much alone. Jimin looked toward him with painful honesty in his eyes. And why did I feel like I had to? That question hit Jungkook hard enough to silence him immediately, because deep down, he didn't know anymore. Somewhere along the way, their relationship became less about comfort and more about survival. Every stressful moment pushed them closer emotionally until eventually distance itself started feeling terrifying. RM quietly stepped in before the conversation spiraled further. Nobody here is blaming either of you. The manager nodded quickly. Exactly. But Jungkook looked unconvinced. Then why does this feel like we're being treated like a problem? Nobody answered immediately because once again, he wasn't completely wrong. J-Hope finally spoke softly from near the window. I think everyone got scared watching both of you burn yourselves out. Jungkook slowly looked toward him. J-Hope continued carefully. But instead of talking honestly about it, people just kept quietly worrying from a distance. Taehyung closed his eyes, briefly hearing that because it described his own mistake perfectly too. Jimin suddenly laughed weakly under his breath, though there was no humor in it. So basically everyone noticed except us. No, Taehyung answered quietly. You noticed too. Jimin looked toward him. Taehyung's expression softened sadly. You were just too afraid of losing each other to face it properly. Silence settled heavily over the room again, because fear really had controlled everything. Fear of abandonment, fear of becoming a burden, fear of emotional collapse, fear of needing someone too much. Jungkook slowly sat back down beside the bed again, looking emotionally exhausted now instead of angry. Then what happens next? He asked quietly. The managers exchanged uncertain glances before answering. That depends on both of you. Jimin frowned slightly. Meaning recovery requires boundaries, the senior manager said carefully. But boundaries only work if they come from honest choices instead of forced distance. The room went quiet again. Jungkook stared down at his hands while processing those words. Jimin watched him silently too. Then suddenly Jin finally spoke after staying quiet too long. Can I say something honestly? Everyone looked toward him. Jin exhaled slowly. I think both of you forgot you're allowed to exist outside each other. The sentence landed softly but painfully. Jimin looked away first. Jungkook remained silent. Jin continued carefully. That doesn't mean your relationship is wrong. His voice softened further. It just means neither of you learned how to protect yourselves individually anymore. RM nodded quietly in agreement. You became each other's safest place. Suga added calmly, and eventually the fear of losing that safety started controlling everything. Jimin's eyes slowly filled again because hearing the truth spoken this clearly made it impossible to hide from anymore. Jungkook finally looked toward him carefully. Were you really that scared? Jimin answered almost immediately. Every day lately. Jungkook's expression cracked emotionally hearing that honesty. Jimin lowered his voice further. Every time you looked stressed, I panicked. He swallowed hard. Every time we drifted emotionally even slightly, I thought something was wrong. Jungkook whispered quietly, me too. The room fell silent again after that mutual confession. Taehyung slowly rubbed one hand across the back of his neck before finally admitting softly, that's what terrified me. Jimin looked toward him carefully now. Taehyung continued. Not your feelings. His eyes shifted briefly between both of them. The fear, nobody argued, because fear really had become the center of everything lately. Fear disguised as protection, fear disguised as loyalty, fear disguised as love. Then suddenly another phone buzz interrupted the silence. This time it belonged to one of the managers. The second he checked the screen, his face changed immediately. RM noticed first. What happened now? The manager looked genuinely alarmed. Another leak. Jungkook immediately stood again. From where? The manager hesitated. Private staff chat logs. Suga cursed quietly under his breath while RM looked exhausted beyond words. What do the messages say? The manager looked uncomfortable answering. Staff members discussing concerns about Jungkook and Jimin becoming emotionally inseparable. Jimin immediately covered his eyes with one trembling hand again while Jungkook's expression darkened into something colder than anger now. Hurt. Deep hurt. People were gossiping about us privately this whole time. Nobody answered quickly enough. Jungkook laughed softly under his breath again, except now the sound felt empty. Unbelievable. Jimin whispered weakly, please stop reading it. Jungkook immediately turned toward him after hearing the strain in his voice. Jimin looked emotionally overwhelmed again. I can't hear any more tonight. The room softened instantly. Jungkook sat beside him again without hesitation this time. Then don't. Jimin slowly lowered his hand from his face while trying to steady his breathing. Jungkook looked toward the managers sharply. Everyone leaves. RM blinked slightly. Jungkook, no. His voice stayed calm but firm now. He needs rest. Not another hour of people analyzing us like some emotional case study. The managers exchanged uncertain looks before finally nodding. Slowly, the room began emptying one by one. Jin quietly squeezed Jimin's shoulder before leaving. J-Hope whispered softly, try sleeping, okay? Taehyung hesitated near the door before finally saying, I really am sorry. Jimin gave a small, tired nod. Then eventually only Jungkook and Jimin remained alone together in the quiet hospital room. The silence afterward felt completely different now. Heavy, honest, fragile. Jungkook slowly leaned back into the chair beside the bed while exhaustion finally showed fully across his face too. Jimin stared quietly toward the ceiling before whispering, do you hate me for this? Jungkook looked shocked instantly. What? Jimin's voice cracked softly. For becoming someone you had to worry about all the time. Jungkook immediately moved closer again, emotion flashing across his face. Jimin. Jimin finally looked toward him with tears building all over again. I don't even know how to be okay anymore. Jungkook's chest tightened painfully hearing that confession, and for several seconds, he had absolutely no idea what to say back. The silence between them stretched painfully after Jimin's confession. The quiet hum of hospital machines filled the room while Jungkook stared at him with an expression that looked almost shattered. Jimin slowly turned his face away first, ashamed of the honesty that had finally escaped him. I don't even know how to be okay anymore. The words stayed hanging heavily in the air long after he said them. Jungkook leaned forward slowly in the chair beside the bed, elbows resting against his knees while he tried gathering his thoughts. For once, he didn't rush to fix the situation immediately, because deep down, he finally understood this wasn't something simple enough to repair with reassurance alone. Jimin needed more than protection, more than promises, more than someone constantly sacrificing themselves beside him. He needed space to heal parts of himself he'd ignored for far too long. And that realization terrified Jungkook more than anything tonight, because for the first time, loving Jimin properly might mean changing the way they existed around each other completely. Jungkook finally spoke softly. You know what I think? Jimin stayed quiet. Jungkook's voice lowered further. I think you got so used to surviving that you forgot healing was even supposed to happen eventually. Jimin's eyes slowly shifted toward him again. Jungkook continued carefully. You spent years carrying pressure quietly. He paused briefly. And every time things became unbearable, you just smiled harder instead. Jimin looked emotional instantly hearing someone finally say it out loud so clearly. Jungkook's expression softened painfully. Then somewhere along the way, I started doing the same thing. The room fell silent again, because that was the truth neither of them wanted to admit earlier. They mirrored each other's self-destruction. Jimin hid pain to avoid burdening Jungkook. Jungkook buried exhaustion to avoid worrying Jimin. Endless emotional sacrifice disguised as love until both of them stopped recognizing their own limits. Jimin whispered quietly, "I thought if I stayed strong enough, things would calm down eventually." Jungkook nodded once slowly. "Me too." Jimin laughed weakly under his breath again. "We really messed this up." Jungkook almost smiled sadly hearing that because somehow the honesty between them now felt more real than anything else tonight. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "We did." Then silence returned again, but this time it felt less hostile, less panicked, like both of them were finally standing in front of the truth instead of running from it. Jimin carefully looked toward Jungkook again after several moments. "Are you angry?" Jungkook frowned slightly. "About what?" "Everything." Jimin's eyes lowered again. "Me collapsing, the rumors, the pressure, the fact everyone thinks we're emotionally messed up now." Jungkook stared at him quietly before finally answering honestly. "I'm angry." Jimin's expression tightened immediately, but Jungkook continued before fear could consume him again. "Just not at you." Jimin looked surprised. Jungkook leaned back slowly into the chair again, exhaustion visible everywhere now. "I'm angry we reached this point without realizing how bad things became." His voice stayed calm, tired. "I'm angry people watched us struggle silently instead of forcing honest conversations sooner." He swallowed hard. "And I'm angry that you felt so alone emotionally while sitting right beside me all this time." Jimin's eyes immediately filled again hearing that last sentence. Jungkook noticed but didn't look away this time. "You should have never had to carry everything that quietly." Jimin whispered weakly. "I didn't know how to stop." Jungkook answered softly. "Neither did I." Another silence followed. Then suddenly Jimin asked something so quietly Jungkook almost missed it. "Do you regret us?" Jungkook looked stunned immediately. "What?" Jimin looked terrified now after finally voicing the fear hiding underneath everything tonight. "If loving me became this exhausting," his voice cracked softly again. "Do you regret it?" Jungkook's expression changed instantly. Not frustration, not anger, pure heartbreak. He moved closer without hesitation this time until he sat directly beside the hospital bed. "Don't ever ask me that again." Jimin looked overwhelmed by the intensity in his voice. Jungkook held his gaze carefully now. "You are not something I regret." Jimin's breathing visibly shook. Jungkook continued more gently this time. "What I regret is letting both of us suffer quietly for so long because we thought protecting each other meant hiding pain." Jimin slowly looked down again while tears slipped silently across his face. Jungkook noticed immediately. This time he carefully reached out and wiped one tear away before speaking again. "Loving you was never the problem." Jimin closed his eyes briefly from the emotional weight of hearing that. Jungkook's thumb hesitated briefly against his cheek before pulling away slowly again. "The problem was us forgetting we're human too." The room fell quiet once more. Outside the hospital window, distant city lights flickered faintly against the dark sky while both of them sat emotionally exhausted beside each other. For the first time in months, neither was pretending anymore. No fake smiles, no emotional avoidance. Just two people finally admitting how badly they'd been hurting underneath everything. Then suddenly Jimin whispered, "I was scared you'd leave someday." Jungkook looked at him instantly. Jimin's voice stayed fragile, honest. "That's why every little change between us started terrifying me." Jungkook stared silently while Jimin continued. "If you looked distant for even one day," he laughed weakly through tears, "I'd spend the entire night wondering what I did wrong." Jungkook's chest tightened painfully hearing that. Because he knew exactly how that felt too. "I thought the same thing whenever you pulled away emotionally," he admitted quietly. Jimin looked shocked hearing that confession. Jungkook gave a tired smile filled with sadness. "See," he shook his head slightly. "We were both panicking silently while trying to look fine." Jimin wiped at his face weakly. "That sounds insane when you say it out loud." Jungkook almost smiled again. "Yeah." Then suddenly his expression softened further. "But it also sounds lonely." That sentence hit Jimin hard enough to completely silence him again. Because loneliness really had become part of their relationship somehow, not because they lacked love, but because fear stopped them from communicating honestly whenever things became difficult. Jimin eventually whispered, "I don't want us to become toxic." Jungkook answered immediately. Then we stop hurting ourselves trying to carry each other completely. Jimin looked uncertain now. Can we actually do that? Jungkook hesitated. Honest hesitation, then finally admitted quietly, I don't know. Jimin looked away again after hearing that uncertainty, but Jungkook continued carefully. I just know I don't want fear controlling us anymore. The room stayed silent after that until suddenly Jungkook's phone buzzed softly against the nearby table again. Both of them immediately tensed. Tonight every notification felt dangerous. Jungkook checked the screen slowly before his expression darkened slightly. Jimin noticed instantly. What happened now? Jungkook hesitated briefly before answering. It's Namjoon. He answered the call quietly while standing near the window. What is it? RM sounded exhausted beyond words already. I need to warn you before you see anything online. Jungkook's stomach tightened immediately. Warn me about what? Silence. Then RM finally answered carefully. Someone leaked the hospital location. Jungkook looked sharply toward the door instantly. You're kidding. I wish I was. RM sounded frustrated now too. There's already people gathering outside. Jimin overheard enough to immediately tense again on the bed. Jungkook rubbed one hand over his face in disbelief. How bad? RM exhaled heavily. Bad enough security, discussing moving Jimin somewhere private before sunrise. Jungkook slowly lowered the phone from his ear slightly. Move him. The media situation's getting dangerous, RM admitted quietly. Then, after a short pause, he added the sentence that made Jungkook's expression completely harden again. And there are already reporters asking if the company plans separating you two permanently after tonight. Backslash. The moment RM said those words, the entire atmosphere inside the hospital room changed again. Jungkook slowly lowered the phone from his ear while disbelief mixed dangerously with exhaustion across his face. Jimin watched him carefully from the bed, already sensing the answer before hearing it. What did he say? Jungkook stayed silent for several seconds. That silence alone terrified Jimin more than the actual words probably would. Jungkook. His voice sounded fragile now. Jungkook finally looked toward him slowly. Reporters are asking if the company's planning to separate us permanently. Jimin immediately looked away. The reaction happened so fast Jungkook noticed instantly. Hey! Jimin shook his head weakly. Maybe they should. Jungkook froze completely. Don't start that again. Jimin's eyes stayed lowered toward the blanket. Look what happened tonight. Jungkook stepped closer immediately. Tonight happened because we ignored our problems for too long. Not because caring about each other is wrong. Jimin whispered quietly, but maybe being this attached is. The words landed hard between them. Jungkook stared at him silently while frustration, fear, and heartbreak fought visibly across his expression again. So what? He finally asked softly. You think cutting each other off suddenly fixes everything? Jimin didn't answer, because deep down he didn't believe that either. The thought of distance hurt almost physically now. But the fear of continuing like this terrified him too. Jungkook slowly sat beside the bed again after ending the call with RM. This time he looked calmer, not because things improved, but because exhaustion finally forced honesty over panic. Listen to me carefully, he said quietly. Jimin slowly looked toward him again. Jungkook held his gaze steadily. I don't care what reporters think. Jimin immediately whispered back, I do. Jungkook's expression softened sadly. I know. Jimin's eyes filled again almost instantly. They already think you're controlling me, his voice cracked, or that I'm emotionally unstable. Jungkook looked furious hearing those words repeated aloud. They don't know us. But the world believes what it sees, Jimin answered weakly. Silence settled again after that because unfortunately, Jimin wasn't wrong either. Public narratives rarely cared about emotional complexity, especially not online. Jungkook slowly rubbed his hands together while staring toward the dark hospital window. You know what hurts the most? Jimin looked at him quietly. Jungkook laughed softly under his breath without humor. The fact that even now, he paused briefly, you're still trying to protect me more than yourself. Jimin looked away immediately. Again, Jungkook noticed and sighed quietly. See, his voice lowered further. You keep doing that. Jimin whispered. I don't know how not to. That answer broke something inside Jungkook again because for the first time he realized Jimin truly meant it. Self-sacrifice wasn't a decision anymore. It had become instinct, survival behavior. Jimin spent so many years putting other people's emotional comfort before his own that now he genuinely didn't know another way to exist. Jungkook leaned forward slightly. Then maybe that's where we start. Jimin frowned weakly. What? Jungkook answered carefully. Learning how to stop destroying ourselves trying to protect everyone else. Jimin stared at him silently. Jungkook's eyes looked exhausted too now, vulnerable in a way he usually hid. Because honestly, he admitted quietly, I'm tired too. Jimin's expression immediately softened hearing that confession. Jungkook continued before fear stopped him again. Not tired of you. His voice became gentler instantly. Never that. Jimin visibly relaxed slightly hearing those words. Jungkook swallowed hard before continuing. I'm tired of both of us pretending pain only matters after someone collapses. Silence followed, heavy silence, honest silence. Then Jimin suddenly whispered, I thought if I admitted how bad things felt, everyone would see me differently. Jungkook answered softly, and now? Jimin looked down slowly. Now I think everyone already knew anyway. That truth hurt, because tonight proved exactly that. Members noticed, family noticed, staff noticed. Everyone saw the emotional exhaustion building except the two people trapped inside it. Jungkook carefully reached for Jimin's hand this time, slowly enough that Jimin could pull away if he wanted. But he didn't. The second their fingers touched, both of them visibly relaxed in the smallest way. Familiar comfort, familiar safety, familiar danger too. Jungkook noticed the contradiction immediately and quietly laughed under his breath again. Jimin looked at him softly. What? Jungkook shook his head slightly. Even now this still feels like the only place I can breathe properly. Jimin's eyes immediately filled again, hearing that because deep down he felt exactly the same way. And that was the terrifying part. Jungkook looked down at their joined hands quietly before speaking again. Maybe that's why we got scared. Jimin stayed silent, listening carefully now. Jungkook's voice softened further. Because when someone becomes your emotional safe place, he paused briefly. Losing them starts feeling like losing oxygen. The room fell completely still after that sentence. Jimin slowly squeezed Jungkook's hand weakly without even realizing it. Jungkook looked at him again. That doesn't mean we stop caring. Jimin whispered quietly. Then what does it mean? Jungkook hesitated honestly, then finally answered. It means we learn how to breathe without panicking first. Jimin stared at him silently for several long seconds. Something emotional shifted across his face again. Not relief exactly, but maybe the first tiny glimpse of understanding. Then suddenly another loud noise erupted from somewhere outside the hospital floor. Both of them immediately looked toward the door. Raised voices echoed faintly through the hallway now. Jungkook stood instantly. What was that? Seconds later, RM rushed inside looking tense again. Security issue. Jimin immediately looked alarmed. What happened? RM shut the door quickly behind him before answering. Some reporters tried sneaking onto the private floor. Jungkook's expression darkened immediately. Are you serious? RM nodded grimly. Security stopped them, but this place isn't safe anymore. Jimin slowly pulled his hand away from Jungkook's without realizing it, anxiety visibly returning across his face. I don't want everyone dealing with this because of me. Jungkook immediately noticed the withdrawal. Jimin. But RM cut in carefully first. They're arranging transport to another location. Jimin frowned weakly. Another hospital. RM hesitated. No. The atmosphere tightened instantly. Jungkook looked suspicious immediately. Then where? RM exhaled heavily before answering. A private recovery house outside the city. Jimin looked confused. Recovery house? RM nodded once. Completely secure, no media access. Jungkook slowly narrowed his eyes. Who decided this? RM stayed quiet for half a second too long. Another terrible sign. Management, he admitted carefully. Jungkook immediately looked furious again. Without asking us, RM raised both hands slightly. They're worried about safety. No, Jungkook answered coldly. They're worried about control. Jimin looked overwhelmed all over again now. I don't want to be hidden away somewhere. RM stepped closer carefully. This isn't punishment. Jimin laughed weakly under his breath. Everyone keeps saying that before suggesting another way to separate us. Silence crashed through the room immediately after he said it, because for the first time tonight, Jimin sounded genuinely afraid of losing Jungkook too. RM looked heartbroken hearing it. Jungkook slowly turned toward Jimin again after several seconds. Do you want to go? Jimin hesitated, long painful hesitation, then finally whispered, only if you come too. Jungkook's eyes widened slightly. RM immediately looked tense. Because suddenly everyone realized exactly what that answer meant. Even now, after everything tonight, neither of them was ready to face the fear of separation alone. And deep down, that terrified everyone more than the rumors ever could. The room fell into complete silence after Jimin's answer. "Only if you come too." Nobody spoke for several long seconds because the emotional weight behind those 6 words said everything. Even after the collapse, even after the fear, even after realizing how deeply dependent they'd become emotionally, Jimin's first instinct was still reaching for Jungkook. And the terrifying part was that Jungkook immediately looked ready to say yes without hesitation. RM noticed it instantly. "Jungkook." His voice stayed calm but cautious. Jungkook slowly looked toward him. RM carefully chose his next words. "You understand why everyone's worried now, right?" Jungkook stayed silent, because honestly, he did understand now. That was what made this so painful. The way his entire body reacted the second Jimin looked scared. The panic he felt imagining distance between them. The instinctive need to stay beside him no matter what. None of it felt healthy anymore. But none of it felt easy to walk away from either. Jimin noticed the hesitation in Jungkook's eyes and immediately looked down toward the blanket again. "Forget it." Jungkook instantly stepped closer. "No." Jimin forced a weak smile that looked heartbreaking to watch. "Everyone's right." His voice lowered softly. "You shouldn't have to keep carrying me around emotionally." Jungkook's expression changed immediately. Hurt. Deep hurt. "Is that seriously what you think this is?" Jimin whispered quietly, "Isn't it?" Jungkook stared at him like the question itself physically hurt. "You think being beside you feels like a burden to me?" Jimin couldn't answer, because deep down he knew the answer already. Jungkook sat beside the bed again, this time visibly fighting his emotions carefully instead of letting them explode. "Jimin." His voice softened instantly. "The problem was never loving you." Jimin's eyes slowly lifted again. Jungkook continued carefully. "The problem is we stopped loving ourselves properly somewhere along the way too." The room went quiet again. RM stayed near the door silently while listening, because finally the conversation sounded different now, less desperate, more aware. Jungkook looked exhausted beyond words while speaking honestly for maybe the first time in months. "I kept acting like protecting you meant solving everything for you." Jimin stared at him quietly. Jungkook laughed softly under his breath. "And every time you struggled emotionally, I treated it like some personal failure." Jimin immediately whispered, "It wasn't your fault." Jungkook nodded slowly. "I know that now." That sentence hit Jimin hard emotionally because it meant Jungkook was finally letting go of guilt too, little by little. Jimin swallowed hard before finally admitting something himself. "And I kept acting like my pain only mattered if it started hurting other people first." Jungkook immediately looked toward him again. Jimin's voice trembled slightly now. "That's why I hid everything." Tears slowly built again in his eyes. "Because I thought if I stayed quiet enough, nobody would have to carry me." Jungkook moved closer instinctively but stopped himself halfway this time, not from fear, from awareness. Jimin noticed that hesitation immediately too. Neither spoke about it, but both understood what it meant now: boundaries, care without drowning, support without losing themselves completely. It felt unfamiliar, fragile. Necessary. RM quietly stepped forward after watching the emotional shift between them carefully. "The recovery house decision doesn't have to happen tonight." Jimin looked exhausted already just hearing more decisions mentioned. Jungkook nodded slowly. "Good." RM continued carefully. "Right now both of you need sleep more than anything else." Nobody argued with that. They looked emotionally destroyed. But before the atmosphere could settle fully, another quiet knock came at the hospital door. Everyone immediately tensed again. RM opened it cautiously before relaxing slightly. It was Jin. And judging by his expression, something else had happened downstairs again. "Fans gathered outside the hospital gates," Jin explained quietly after stepping inside. Jimin immediately looked anxious again. "Are they angry?" Jin blinked slightly, surprised by the question. "No." He looked softer suddenly. "Most of them are worried." Jungkook slowly looked toward Jimin after hearing that. Jin continued quietly. "Some are holding signs asking people to stop spreading rumors." The room went silent again. Jimin looked genuinely stunned. Jin gave a small, tired smile. "Not everyone out there is trying to destroy you." Jimin's eyes slowly filled again hearing that because after hours of terrifying headlines and emotional exposure, he almost forgot people could still respond with kindness too. Jungkook noticed the emotional shift immediately. "See." Jimin looked down weakly. "I'm still scared." Jungkook answered softly, "I know." Jin eventually sat near the end of the bed while speaking more gently now. "People are worried because they care about you, not because they think you're broken." Jimin quietly wiped at his face. It doesn't feel that simple online. Jin sighed heavily. Online never feels simple. That answer actually made Jungkook smile faintly for the first time all night. Tiny, exhausted, but real. Jimin noticed it immediately too. And somehow seeing Jungkook smile after everything made his chest ache emotionally in the strangest way. Then suddenly Jin looked toward Jungkook carefully. You need rest too. Jungkook immediately shook his head. I'm fine. 3 people in the room reacted instantly. No, you're not, RM answered first. Jin nodded immediately after. Even Jimin whispered weakly, you look terrible. Jungkook stared at all of them in disbelief before laughing softly under his breath again. Wow, thanks. The tension eased slightly for the first time in hours. Small, fragile, but real. Then Jimin quietly looked toward Jungkook again after the silence settled. Can I ask you something honestly? Jungkook's expression softened immediately. Always. Jimin hesitated briefly before finally asking the question sitting inside him all night. When you thought about disappearing for a while, his voice lowered. Did you ever think about leaving me too? Jungkook's face changed instantly. Never. The answer came so fast it almost startled everyone. Jimin looked emotionally overwhelmed hearing it. Jungkook continued carefully now. I thought about escaping pressure. He swallowed hard. Not escaping you. Jimin slowly closed his eyes for a second after hearing that. Relief mixed painfully with guilt across his exhausted face. Jungkook quietly added, honestly, part of the reason I stayed was because I knew losing me suddenly would destroy you emotionally. Jimin immediately looked ashamed hearing that truth out loud. Jungkook noticed instantly. And before you spiral again, his voice softened further. That's not blame. Jimin stayed silent. Jungkook leaned back slightly in the chair beside him. It just means we became too responsible for each other's survival. RM quietly nodded from near the door. That's the part that needs to change. Jimin whispered softly, I don't know how. Jungkook answered honestly this time instead of pretending confidence. Neither do I, then after a brief pause, he added quietly, but maybe learning together is different from destroying ourselves together. The room fell silent again after that sentence. Jin slowly looked toward RM, both of them realizing something important at the exact same moment. For the first time tonight, Jungkook and Jimin weren't speaking from panic anymore. They were finally speaking from awareness. It didn't magically solve everything. The dependence was still there. The fear was still there. But now the honesty existed too, and maybe that was the first real step toward healing. Then suddenly RM's phone buzzed softly again. He checked the message before exhaling heavily. Management's backing off for tonight. Jungkook immediately frowned suspiciously. Why? RM looked toward both of them carefully. Because the hospital staff threatened legal action over the leaks. Jin muttered quietly. Good, but RM wasn't finished. There's still pressure building publicly, though. Jimin immediately tensed slightly again. RM quickly continued before anxiety could spiral further. But something else is happening too. Everyone looked toward him. RM's expression softened in a way nobody expected. A lot of people online are actually defending both of you. Jimin looked genuinely confused. Defending us? RM nodded slowly. People are talking openly about burnout now, emotional pressure. Mental exhaustion. Jungkook blinked slightly in surprise too. RM gave a tired smile. For the first time tonight, the conversation online isn't only gossip anymore. The room became quiet after that. Jimin slowly stared toward the dark hospital window while processing those words carefully. Then finally he whispered something so softly it almost disappeared beneath the quiet hum of the machines. Maybe hiding everything all the time really was killing us. And judging by the silence afterward. Everyone in the room knew he was right. The quiet after Jimin's words felt strangely peaceful compared to the chaos from earlier. Not because the problems disappeared. Nothing about tonight was magically fixed. The rumors still existed. The pressure still waited outside the hospital walls. The emotional damage between them still needed real healing. But for the first time in a long while, nobody inside the room was pretending anymore. Jimin leaned back carefully against the hospital bed, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline that kept him awake for hours. Jungkook stayed beside him quietly, not hovering as intensely as before but still present, still steady. RM noticed the difference immediately. The space between them looked smaller emotionally somehow, even while they were trying harder not to lose themselves inside each other again. Jin eventually stood slowly from his chair near the end of the bed. I'm going downstairs for a bit. RM looked toward him cautiously. Why? Jin sighed heavily. The staff said some fans have been standing outside for hours in the cold. Jimin immediately looked worried. Because of me, Jin answered softly, because they care. Jimin lowered his eyes again after hearing that. He still didn't fully know how to process concern without turning it into guilt first. Jungkook noticed immediately but said nothing this time. He was learning, slowly, painfully, but learning. Jin eventually left the room while RM moved closer toward the window. Security says things are calming down outside now. Jimin nodded weakly. Jungkook finally leaned his head back against the chair and closed his eyes briefly for the first time in hours. The exhaustion covering him looked brutal now that the anger faded. Dark circles under his eyes. Tension still visible in his jaw even while resting. Jimin quietly watched him for several seconds before whispering softly, "You really stayed awake this entire time." Jungkook opened one eye slightly. "Pretty sure everyone did." "No." Jimin's expression softened sadly. "You were panicking." Jungkook closed his eyes again briefly after hearing that blunt honesty, then eventually admitted quietly, "Yeah." Jimin looked down at his hands resting weakly over the blanket. "I'm sorry." Jungkook immediately opened his eyes again. "Stop apologizing every 5 minutes." Jimin gave the faintest, exhausted smile hearing that. Jungkook looked toward him more seriously now. "You scared me tonight." Jimin swallowed hard. "I know." Jungkook's voice lowered further. "I thought I was going to lose you." The room fell silent again. Jimin's eyes slowly filled, but this time the emotion looked different, softer, less frantic. Jungkook rubbed tiredly at his face before continuing honestly. "And when I realized how terrified I was." He laughed weakly under his breath. "That's when I understood Taehyung wasn't completely wrong either." Jimin looked surprised hearing that admission. RM quietly glanced toward Jungkook too. Jungkook continued carefully. "We became too emotionally responsible for each other." Jimin whispered softly. "Does that mean things between us have to change completely?" Jungkook stayed quiet for several seconds before answering honestly. "I think they have to change enough that we stop destroying ourselves." Jimin's chest tightened emotionally hearing those words because deep down he knew Jungkook was right. The problem wasn't their feelings. It was the fear attached to them. The panic, the emotional dependence, the exhaustion from trying to survive entirely through another person's presence. RM finally spoke quietly from near the window. "That doesn't mean you stop loving each other." Both of them looked toward him instantly. RM gave a tired but gentle expression. "It just means love shouldn't feel like drowning all the time." Silence followed. Then Jungkook quietly muttered under his breath, "Wish someone told us that sooner." RM almost smiled sadly hearing it. "I think people tried." Jungkook looked down. "Yeah." Taehyung's warnings, Jin's concern, Suga noticing burnout, even staff documenting emotional strain quietly in the background. The signs really had been everywhere. Jimin eventually whispered, "I think I was too scared to hear it." Jungkook nodded slowly. "Me too." Then suddenly another soft knock interrupted the room. This time Suga stepped inside carrying 2 bottled drinks and a small paper bag. "Hospital vending machines are terrible," he muttered quietly while handing one drink toward Jungkook. Jungkook accepted it immediately with tired gratitude. Suga looked toward Jimin carefully. "You're not allowed caffeine." Jimin almost smiled weakly. "Cruel." The small moment eased the atmosphere further. Suga sat near the wall afterward, watching both of them quietly before eventually speaking. "You know something?" Jungkook looked toward him. Suga crossed his arms loosely. "Tonight was ugly." Nobody argued. "But maybe it needed to happen." Jimin frowned slightly. "Collapsing needed to happen." Suga shook his head slowly. "No." His expression softened unexpectedly. "The honesty did." The room went quiet again after that, because despite all the pain tonight caused, everyone finally stopped hiding. Jimin stopped pretending he could handle everything alone. Jungkook stopped pretending he could protect everyone without collapsing himself. The members stopped pretending they weren't worried. Even management was forced to acknowledge emotional damage instead of silently covering it. Suga eventually continued quietly. "You two spent so long acting strong for everyone else that eventually nobody knew how bad things actually became." Jungkook stared at the unopened bottle in his hands silently. Jimin whispered weakly, "I didn't want people worrying." Suga immediately answered, "People worry more when someone breaks unexpectedly." That truth hit hard because it explained tonight perfectly. Silence, pressure, collapse, then chaos. Jimin slowly leaned his head back against the pillow while processing everything. "I hate feeling weak." Jungkook looked toward him immediately. "You're not weak." Jimin laughed softly under his breath. I cried in front of half the company tonight. Jungkook answered quietly, That's called being human. Jimin looked emotionally overwhelmed hearing those words because for years he treated emotional suffering like personal failure instead of reality. Jungkook noticed and carefully added, You don't have to earn the right to struggle. The room fell silent again. Suga quietly looked away afterward, giving them space emotionally without physically leaving. Then after several long moments, Jimin suddenly whispered something that made Jungkook's expression tighten immediately. I think part of me believed you'd stop loving me if I became too difficult. Jungkook stared at him in disbelief. Jimin's voice stayed fragile, honest. That's why I kept hiding things. Jungkook moved closer instinctively again before catching himself halfway. He noticed the habit immediately and exhaled slowly. Jimin noticed too. Neither commented on it. Jungkook eventually spoke softly. You know what scares me? Jimin looked toward him carefully. Jungkook's eyes looked exhausted but painfully sincere now. That you spent so much time beside me and still thought my love depended on you staying okay all the time. Jimin immediately looked emotional again hearing that. Jungkook continued gently. You could break down 1,000 times and I'd still stay. Jimin whispered weakly. That's exactly what scares everyone. The room fell quiet immediately after that sentence, because once again Jimin wasn't wrong. Jungkook's loyalty ran so deep it often crossed into self-destruction too. Jungkook slowly looked down while processing the truth inside those words. Then eventually he nodded once. Yeah. Honest acceptance this time, not denial. That's something I need to fix too. Jimin watched him carefully after hearing that because for the first time maybe ever, Jungkook was admitting he needed healing too instead of only focusing on protecting others. Then suddenly RM's phone buzzed again. He checked the message before looking surprised. What? Suga asked quietly. RM looked toward Jimin and Jungkook carefully. The leaked backstage footage, he hesitated briefly. The original uploader deleted it. Everyone looked stunned. Why? Jungkook asked immediately. RM slowly read from the screen. Apparently public backlash got intense after people realized the clip showed emotional burnout instead of scandal drama. Jimin blinked slightly in confusion. People defended us. RM nodded once. More than expected. The room fell silent again. After hours of fear and exposure and emotional collapse, none of them were prepared for compassion. Then RM quietly added one more thing that shifted the atmosphere entirely. There's a hashtag trending right now. Jungkook frowned slightly. What kind of hashtag? RM looked toward both of them carefully before answering softly. One asking idols to stop suffering silently just to look strong. The room stayed quiet after RM read the hashtag aloud. Nobody reacted immediately because after everything tonight, compassion felt almost harder to process than criticism. Jimin stared blankly toward the blanket over his legs while Jungkook slowly leaned back in the chair beside him again, visibly exhausted. Suga quietly muttered under his breath, That's unexpected. RM nodded slowly. A lot of people are talking about burnout now instead of rumors. Jimin looked confused. Why? RM gave a tired smile that barely existed. Because people recognized real pain when they saw it. Silence followed again. Jimin swallowed hard while trying to process that sentence. For years, he convinced himself showing emotional exhaustion publicly would only disappoint people. But tonight, the truth escaped anyway. And instead of only judgment, some people responded with concern, understanding, even support. Jungkook quietly looked toward him. See? Jimin's eyes lowered again. I still feel embarrassed. Jungkook answered softly. That feeling doesn't disappear overnight. Jimin looked toward him carefully now. Jungkook's expression softened further. But maybe hiding everything forever wasn't protecting anyone either. Jimin slowly exhaled after hearing that because deep down he knew it was true now. Silence nearly destroyed them more than honesty ever did. Then suddenly Suga stood from the wall quietly. I'm going downstairs. RM frowned slightly. Why? Suga shrugged lightly. Someone should check if Jin started fighting reporters yet. That actually made Jungkook laugh softly for the first time all night. Small, tired, real. Jimin looked toward him immediately after hearing it, and somehow that tiny laugh felt more emotional than all the shouting from earlier. Suga noticed too before quietly leaving the room. Once the door closed again, the atmosphere softened further. RM eventually moved toward the opposite side of the room, giving them more privacy while pretending to check messages. Jimin carefully watched Jungkook in silence for a few moments before finally whispering, You look different. Jungkook blinked slightly. Different how? Jimin hesitated. Calmer. Jungkook looked down at his hands quietly. I think I ran out of energy to panic. Jimin gave the faintest weak smile. That's unhealthy. Jungkook almost smiled back. Probably. Then his expression softened again while looking at Jimin carefully. But honestly, he paused briefly, I think hearing you finally tell the truth tonight changed something. Jimin looked uncertain. What truth? Jungkook answered immediately. That you were scared. Jimin's eyes lowered again. Jungkook continued softly. You spent so long pretending everything was fine that I forgot you were terrified too. Jimin looked emotional hearing that because he really had hidden fear behind smiles for too long. I thought if I admitted how overwhelmed I felt, he swallowed hard, you'd start worrying even more. Jungkook laughed quietly under his breath without humor. Meanwhile, I was already panicking every day because I knew something was wrong. Jimin blinked slightly. Every day, Jungkook nodded slowly. You stopped sleeping properly. Jimin looked surprised immediately. Jungkook continued carefully. You smiled differently when you were tired emotionally. Jimin stared at him silently now. Jungkook's voice lowered further, and every time I asked if you were okay, he gave a weak, tired smile. You lied. Jimin looked ashamed again. I'm sorry. Jungkook immediately sighed softly. See, there you go apologizing again instead of just admitting you were struggling. Jimin slowly rubbed at his eyes weakly. I didn't know how to need help without feeling guilty. That sentence hit hard because it explained so much at once. Jungkook quietly nodded afterward. I think that's what almost destroyed you. Jimin looked toward him carefully. Jungkook continued. You kept treating your pain like an inconvenience instead of something real. Jimin whispered weakly, maybe because I saw everyone else suffering too. Jungkook's expression softened instantly hearing that because once again, Jimin's instinct was focusing on other people first. Jungkook leaned forward slightly. And who was taking care of you? Jimin stayed silent because there wasn't an answer. Not really. People cared about him deeply. But emotionally, he rarely let anyone fully in whenever things became unbearable. Jungkook eventually whispered quietly, you don't have to disappear emotionally just because other people are hurting too. Jimin's eyes slowly filled again hearing that. Then after a few seconds, he asked something so softly it almost disappeared into the quiet room. Do you think we can actually change? Jungkook stayed silent longer this time. Honest silence, not avoidance. Finally, he admitted quietly, I think we have to. Jimin looked nervous immediately after hearing that phrasing. Jungkook noticed. Not because we're bad for each other. His voice softened quickly. Because we deserve better than surviving in fear all the time. The room fell quiet again after that. Outside the hospital window, faint lights from cameras still flashed occasionally far below near the entrance gates. The world outside continued moving loudly while inside the room everything finally felt still for the first time tonight. RM eventually looked up from across the room. You know something? Jungkook glanced toward him. RM gave a tired expression. For years, everyone thought strength meant enduring pressure quietly. Jimin listened carefully now too. RM continued softly. But maybe real strength is admitting when something hurts before it destroys you. Silence followed again. Heavy, honest. Jimin slowly closed his eyes briefly while processing those words. Then eventually he whispered, I don't think I've ever been good at that. Jungkook answered immediately. Then learn now. Jimin looked toward him softly. Jungkook's voice stayed gentle. Not alone this time. That sentence settled warmly through the room despite the exhaustion still surrounding everything. Because for the first time, support no longer sounded like drowning. It sounded steadier, more aware. Then suddenly a vibration against the nearby table interrupted the quiet again. Jungkook looked down at his phone before frowning slightly. Jimin immediately tensed. What happened? Jungkook checked the screen carefully before exhaling slowly. It's Taehyung. The atmosphere shifted slightly again at the mention of his name. Not hostile now, just complicated. Jungkook answered quietly. What is it? Taehyung sounded exhausted too. I wanted to ask if Jimin's okay. Jungkook glanced toward Jimin before answering honestly. Still overwhelmed. Silence briefly filled the call before Taehyung finally whispered something unexpected. Tell him I'm sorry for making him feel cornered tonight. Jimin overheard enough to quietly speak up himself. Taehyung. Silence immediately followed from the other end before Taehyung answered softly. Yeah. Jimin swallowed hard. You weren't wrong. Jungkook looked toward him immediately. Jimin continued quietly into the phone. Your timing was terrible. Taehyung laughed weakly under his breath. Fair. Jimin's expression softened sadly. But you noticed we were struggling before we did. Silence settled heavily over the call afterward. Then Taehyung quietly admitted, I was scared watching both of you disappear emotionally. Jungkook lowered his eyes after hearing that because deep down he understood now. Jimin eventually whispered softly, I'm sorry too. Taehyung immediately answered, don't apologize for breaking down. Jimin's eyes widened slightly hearing that response. Taehyung's voice softened further. Just don't go through it alone next time. The room became quiet again after the call ended. Jungkook slowly placed the phone back down before leaning his head back against the chair once more. Exhaustion visibly pulled at him now harder than before. Jimin quietly watched him for a few seconds before asking softly, have you slept at all this week? Jungkook blinked slowly. What? Jimin's eyes narrowed slightly despite exhaustion. See, that answer already tells me no. Jungkook looked caught immediately. RM sighed from across the room. Honestly, both of you need supervision at this point. That actually pulled another faint, tired laugh from Jimin too. Small, weak, but real enough that Jungkook immediately looked relieved hearing it. Then suddenly the hospital room lights dimmed slightly automatically as late-night settings activated throughout the floor. The quieter atmosphere wrapped around the room gently while exhaustion finally began overtaking everyone fully. Jimin slowly looked toward Jungkook one more time before whispering softly, stay until I fall asleep. Jungkook answered without hesitation this time. Always. And somehow, for the first time that night, the word no longer sounded dangerous. The room grew quieter as the night deepened around them. The dim hospital lights softened everything, turning the chaos from earlier into something distant and unreal. Jimin rested against the pillows with heavy eyes, while Jungkook remained seated beside the bed exactly where he promised he would stay. RM sat near the window silently scrolling through updates on his phone, though even he looked emotionally drained beyond words now. Nobody had enough energy left for arguments, or panic, or pretending. Silence finally felt honest. Jimin slowly turned his head slightly toward Jungkook again after several quiet minutes passed. You're still awake. Jungkook blinked tiredly. So are you. Jimin gave the faintest, exhausted smile. I thought you were supposed to watch me sleep. Jungkook almost smiled back. Pretty sure that's creepy when you say it like that. Another tiny laugh escaped Jimin before he winced slightly from the lingering exhaustion in his body. Jungkook immediately straightened in concern. You okay? Jimin nodded quickly. Relax. RM looked up from across the room immediately. Neither of you knows how to relax. Jungkook sighed softly while Jimin muttered weakly. That's becoming painfully obvious tonight. The atmosphere eased again in the smallest way, and maybe that was what healing actually looked like at first. Not dramatic breakthroughs, just tiny moments where breathing stopped feeling impossible. Jungkook quietly looked toward Jimin again after the silence settled. Can I tell you something honestly? Jimin's expression softened. You already told me everything tonight. Jungkook shook his head slightly. Not this. Jimin waited quietly. Jungkook looked down at his hands before finally speaking. When they said people wanted us separated, his jaw tightened briefly. Part of me got angry because I thought everyone was trying to take away the only thing keeping me stable, too. Jimin stared at him silently. Jungkook's voice lowered further. And that scared me. The confession hung heavily in the room because it was the first time Jungkook openly admitted his dependence too instead of only focusing on protecting Jimin. RM slowly lowered his phone after hearing it. Jimin whispered softly, You never said that before. Jungkook nodded once. Because I didn't want it to be true. Silence settled again. Then Jungkook carefully continued. I kept acting like I was stronger than this. He laughed weakly under his breath. Meanwhile, one bad day between us could ruin my entire week emotionally. Jimin's eyes slowly filled hearing that honesty because he understood it completely, too completely. Jungkook finally looked toward him directly again. That's not healthy. Jimin whispered quietly, no. But there was no shame in the answer anymore, just honesty. Jungkook leaned back into the chair slowly. I don't want us living like we're constantly afraid of losing each other. Jimin stared toward the ceiling for a moment before answering softly. Then maybe we stop treating love like survival. The room became completely still after that sentence. Even RM quietly looked toward them again because something about Jimin's voice sounded different now. Softer, clearer, like he finally understood something important tonight. Jungkook slowly nodded afterward. Yeah. Jimin swallowed hard before continuing quietly. I think somewhere along the way I stopped believing I could stand emotionally on my own anymore. Jungkook's expression immediately softened with sadness. Jimin looked ashamed again briefly before forcing himself to continue honestly anyway. Every time things became overwhelming, he paused weakly. I just looked for you first instead of dealing with myself. Jungkook answered carefully this time. And every time I saw you struggling, he looked down slightly. I tried fixing everything instead of asking what you actually needed. Another silence followed. Honest silence again, not avoidance. Jimin eventually whispered, "We really lost balance." Jungkook nodded quietly, but maybe realizing it matters. RM finally stood slowly from his seat near the window before stretching tiredly. It matters a lot. Both of them looked toward him. RM gave a small, exhausted smile. Most people never reach the honesty part. The room quieted again after that. Outside the hospital, distant camera flashes still flickered occasionally through the dark windows. But somehow the noise from the outside world felt farther away now, less powerful. Jimin eventually looked toward Jungkook carefully again. Do you think things will ever feel normal again? Jungkook thought about it seriously this time instead of immediately reassuring him. No, he admitted quietly. Jimin's expression tightened slightly, but Jungkook continued softly. I think things will feel different. Jimin listened carefully. Jungkook's voice lowered further. Hopefully healthier. Jimin slowly exhaled after hearing that because deep down healthier sounded better than normal now. Normal was what led them here in the first place. Endless schedules, endless pressure, endless emotional silence. Jungkook eventually leaned his head back against the chair while staring toward the ceiling too. You know what's weird? Jimin looked toward him. Jungkook gave a tired smile. Tonight was probably one of the worst nights of my life. Jimin immediately looked guilty again. Jungkook noticed and pointed lightly toward him without even opening his eyes. Don't start apologizing. Jimin weakly rolled his eyes. You can tell when I'm about to do it now. Jungkook finally smiled faintly. Unfortunately, yes. Even RM quietly laughed under his breath hearing that. Jungkook eventually opened his eyes again before finishing softly, but somehow tonight also feels like the first honest conversation we've had in months. The room went quiet after that because once again, he was right. Jimin slowly nodded while looking down at his hands. I think I forgot people could still stay after seeing the worst parts of me. Jungkook immediately answered without hesitation. Then remember this night. Jimin looked toward him again. Jungkook's eyes stayed steady this time. Calm, because nobody left. The emotion on Jimin's face shifted instantly hearing that. Not dramatic, just deep, quietly overwhelming. RM looked away respectfully as Jimin's eyes filled once more. Jungkook noticed too but didn't rush to fix it anymore. He simply stayed there beside him. Present, steady, enough. Jimin eventually whispered softly, "Thank you." Jungkook tilted his head slightly. For what? Jimin's voice trembled faintly. For staying even after seeing how bad things got. Jungkook stared at him for several seconds before answering quietly. You really need to stop thinking people only love you when you're easy. Jimin looked down again immediately because the sentence hit directly into old wounds he rarely spoke about. Jungkook softened instantly afterward. You don't have to perform strength all the time. Jimin swallowed hard before whispering, I don't know how to stop yet. Jungkook nodded once slowly. Then learn slowly. Silence settled one last time across the room afterward. Peaceful silence this time, exhausted but lighter somehow. Then eventually RM checked the time before speaking quietly. It's almost sunrise. Jimin blinked tiredly toward the faint beginning light appearing beyond the hospital windows. Jungkook followed his gaze too. The dark sky outside had slowly begun turning gray-blue. Morning was coming. After everything tonight, they somehow made it to morning. Jimin whispered softly while staring toward the growing light outside. It feels strange. Jungkook looked toward him. Jimin's tired expression softened faintly. The world kept moving even after everything fell apart. Jungkook quietly answered, maybe because this wasn't the end. The room fell silent once more after that. And as the first sunlight slowly touched the edge of the hospital window, none of them noticed the message arriving quietly on RM's phone from management downstairs. A message containing one final decision already being prepared behind closed doors. A decision that would test whether Jungkook and Jimin truly learned how to heal separately, or whether fear would pull them back into the exact same cycle all over again. Morning finally arrived over the hospital skyline, but the peace inside the room didn't last long. RM slowly lowered his phone after reading the message from management, and the expression on his face immediately made Jungkook sit up straighter. What is it? RM hesitated. That hesitation alone was enough to make Jimin tense again from the hospital bed. Jungkook stood instantly. Namjoon. RM exhaled heavily before finally speaking. They made a decision overnight. The atmosphere inside the room turned cold immediately. Jimin's fingers tightened weakly around the blanket while Jungkook stared directly at RM, already expecting the worst. What decision? RM looked toward both of them carefully now. The company wants to suspend all joint schedules involving you two temporarily. Silence crashed through the room. Jimin slowly looked down first. Jungkook's expression hardened instantly. You're kidding. RM shook his head once. They think distance is necessary while things calm down publicly. Jungkook laughed softly under his breath, but there was no humor in the sound anymore, only disbelief. So after everything tonight, he looked away sharply. That's their solution. Jimin stayed quiet, too quiet. Jungkook immediately noticed and turned toward him. Don't. Jimin whispered weakly, maybe this is what needs to happen. Jungkook stared at him like the sentence physically hurt. You don't actually believe that. Jimin finally looked up, exhaustion visible everywhere across his face now. I think everyone's scared of what we became. Silence, heavy silence. Then RM quietly added the part neither of them expected. There's one more condition. Jungkook slowly looked toward him again. RM hesitated before speaking carefully. Management wants both of you attending separate recovery programs. The room froze completely. Jimin blinked slowly in confusion. Jungkook's voice dropped dangerously calm again. Separate, RM nodded once. Different locations. Jimin's face immediately lost color while Jungkook looked genuinely furious again for the first time since dawn. Absolutely not. RM stepped forward carefully. Jungkook. No. His voice sharpened instantly. After everything we just realized tonight, they think isolating us from each other fixes it. Jimin suddenly spoke softly before the argument exploded further. Maybe they think we need to learn how to stand alone again. Jungkook turned toward him immediately. Hurt flashed visibly across his face now. You want this? Jimin looked torn apart by the question itself, because deep down he didn't know anymore. The thought of distance terrified him. But another part of him feared staying exactly the same even more. Jungkook noticed the hesitation in his eyes, and somehow that hesitation hurt worse than any rumor online ever could. RM quietly looked away while the silence between them grew heavier by the second. Then suddenly Jimin whispered the sentence that changed everything. If we can't survive separately for a little while, his voice cracked softly, then maybe everyone was right to worry about us. Jungkook froze completely. And for the first time since the accident, neither of them knew what to say next. The hospital room stayed painfully silent after Jimin's words. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed comfortably. Jungkook stood frozen beside the bed while Jimin avoided looking directly at him, almost like he already regretted saying the truth out loud. Because deep down, both of them knew this wasn't really about schedules anymore. It was about fear. Fear of separation. Fear of dependence. Fear of discovering who they were without constantly leaning on each other emotionally. RM quietly stepped toward the door, giving them space without saying another word. The second the room became private again, the tension between Jungkook and Jimin felt almost unbearable. Jungkook finally spoke first, his voice lower now, exhausted. So that's it. Jimin immediately looked up. That's not what I meant. Jungkook laughed weakly under his breath while shaking his head. Then what did you mean? Jimin swallowed hard before answering honestly. I meant maybe we've been holding each other so tightly that we forgot how to breathe separately. Silence. Jungkook stared at him for several long seconds before slowly sitting back down in the chair beside the bed. This time he didn't look angry anymore, just tired, deeply tired. You know what scares me? He asked quietly. Jimin listened carefully. Jungkook lowered his eyes briefly. Part of me still wants to refuse immediately. Jimin's chest tightened emotionally hearing that honesty. Jungkook continued softly. Part of me wants to keep staying beside you every second because that feels safer than facing any of this. Jimin whispered weakly, me too. The confession settled heavily between them, honest, fragile, real. Jungkook eventually leaned back into the chair while staring toward the slowly brightening morning outside the window. But maybe safe isn't always healthy. Jimin's eyes immediately filled hearing that because it sounded like the hardest sentence Jungkook ever forced himself to say. Jimin slowly wiped at his face before speaking again. I don't want us to disappear from each other. Jungkook looked toward him immediately. Jimin's voice trembled softly now. I just don't want fear controlling us anymore. Another silence followed. Then finally Jungkook nodded once, small, painful, but real. Okay. Jimin blinked slightly. Okay. Jungkook exhaled slowly while forcing himself to stay steady emotionally. If this is really about healing, his jaw tightened briefly, then maybe we try. Jimin looked emotional instantly hearing that answer because deep down he knew how hard those words were for Jungkook to say. Jungkook slowly stood afterward and walked toward the hospital window, hands inside his pockets while morning sunlight touched the edge of his face. But listen carefully. Jimin watched him quietly. Jungkook looked back toward him now, eyes calmer than before. Distance only works if we use it to grow. Jimin nodded slowly. Jungkook continued. Not to punish ourselves. Jimin's breathing visibly shook while emotion built again in his chest. What if things change between us? Jungkook stayed silent for several seconds before finally answering honestly. Things already changed. Jimin looked down immediately, but Jungkook's voice softened afterward. That doesn't automatically mean something ends. The room became quiet once more. Outside, the world continued waking up while inside the hospital room both of them sat in front of a future neither fully understood yet. Recovery. Space. Healing separately without emotionally abandoning each other completely. It sounded simple when explained calmly, but emotionally it felt terrifying. Jimin eventually whispered softly, I don't know who I am without constantly worrying about everyone. Jungkook looked toward him carefully. Then maybe this is where you finally learn. Jimin gave the faintest broken laugh. That sounds difficult. Jungkook almost smiled sadly. Yeah. Then after a brief pause, he added quietly, but collapsing like this was difficult too. That truth silenced both of them again, because despite how painful tonight became, neither wanted to return to the version of themselves slowly breaking apart in silence. Jimin finally leaned his head back against the pillow while exhaustion overtook him completely now. Promise me something. Jungkook stepped closer again instinctively before stopping himself halfway. A small habit both of them noticed immediately now. Jimin's eyes softened faintly seeing it. What? Jungkook asked quietly. Jimin looked at him carefully. Don't disappear emotionally while we're apart. Jungkook stared at him for several seconds before nodding once. Only if you promise the same thing. Jimin slowly smiled for the first time since the accident. Tiny. Weak. But real enough to completely change the atmosphere in the room. Jungkook noticed immediately, and for a second, the heaviness inside his chest loosened too. Not gone. Just lighter. Then suddenly another knock interrupted the quiet morning. RM carefully opened the door again before looking between both of them cautiously. The cars are here. Silence returned instantly, because suddenly this wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was real. Jimin slowly looked toward Jungkook again while emotion visibly built in both of their eyes at the exact same time. Fear still existed, so did uncertainty. But underneath all of it now, there was finally honesty too. Jungkook eventually reached forward carefully, resting one hand briefly against Jimin's shoulder, not holding too tightly, not desperately, just enough. We'll figure it out. Jimin looked up at him softly. Even separately, Jungkook's expression gentled completely then. Especially separately. Neither of them realized it yet, but that single sentence would become the beginning of everything that changed afterward. Not the end of their relationship, not the destruction everyone feared. But the first real moment both of them finally understood that love could survive without fear controlling it every second. And as Jungkook slowly stepped back, while hospital staff prepared to move Jimin quietly through the private hallway before reporters noticed, both of them carried the exact same terrifying thoughts silently inside their hearts. What if learning how to stand alone was the only reason they might finally survive together someday?